Hi, I'm IKEA, and for today's video, we're going to have an in-depth look into the PTS for Year 7 Season 3, as that has just come to pass and has ended by the time you're seeing this video. But I definitely wanted to give my thoughts on some of the things in there, as there's a lot of interesting stuff and things. We're getting a modifier through which we're getting a companion, just a waifu to drag along along the way. Or in this case, well, they're all husband-dos. Not sure if that is a correct term for them, but it is now. And we are getting a bunch of interesting items. A brand set that is definitely looking to be part of the new meta. And we're getting a gear set that is, actual upon use, pretty interesting and works decently well. And some exotics, of course, to go with that. And then also, together with all of that, also some new talent. And yeah, all of this is planned to come out in a few weeks. And everything will be timestamped down below here so you can jump around to your heart's content, as we'll go through all of the items here. Starting off with the patch notes, we'll link to that, of course, as well. And yeah, I'll link it to the spreadsheet, the big one that we have ready for this session, as yeah, we have 11 multi-calculators, which I'm not sure is a new record, but I think it might be. And part of that is especially because of the new brand set. We kind of need to look at it in situ with a lot of builds. And actually, even then, I don't feel I've done it a full justice, but good enough for now. And then, of course, in the future, we'll give it a full in-depth look by itself and then go much further. But yeah, let's go get started. And let's start that by going through the patch notes really briefly, although we're actually not going to read them out loud, but just I'll link it to the patch notes down below. It does list, of course, all of the items as we have them here, going through the modifier and then through all of the items, the exotics, the gear sets, the brand sets, and the talent. And yeah, there is actually in the PTS a bunch of things that are actually known as to be known issues. So we didn't get to test, for instance, the engineer companion, as we see here. There's a lot of known issues with them. And some items as well have actually intended or are intended to have different stats than we'll finally see. And I'll actually be presenting them basically with the stats in the patch notes as here. As for instance, for the Bittersweet exotic rifle, we'll see in a little bit, they actually have a different in-game value for the repair skill and how much bonus armor that gives you versus what they intend, at least the intentions that they've told us about here. And yeah, there is actually a lot of things here, but it's also not that extensive. Mostly because also they haven't gone into the minutiae of the modifier, and we won't either here. I'll broadly cover it. And then, of course, in the future, we'll give it a full in-depth look, and then also likely and only tips. But the patch notes are well worth going through, especially to catch all of the hard values if you miss something here, or to just double check. And yeah, that'll be linked down below. And let's start our actual look at things by looking at the modifier. The modifier for next season is called Command Link, and by itself, it isn't actually that strong of a modifier. It is centered around a companion, which we'll look at in a second. But this Command Link is, from a power perspective, definitely one of the weaker ones, modifier-wise, that we've gotten so far, which I'm also totally fine with. After a season that was very OP with its modifier, I'm kind of actually looking forward to, and I've already in the PTS really enjoyed actually going back to something a little bit more tame, even though there is a lot of power here as well. Because for instance, as we'll quickly look into the command link basically allows us to use that on PC T button, and then whatever button it is on controller to activate, for instance, the modifier and such. That now actually has different uses depending on what we're doing. So for instance, aim plus that modifier key is attack target, just holding it without aiming for a long press, basically we're getting the triggering the active ability, and also just without ADSing or aiming, we're just telling them where to move, but we can basically only do that to cover. And this True Sun Companion, as we see in here, they just follow us around. Here I have the medic out, And outside of combat, we can't actually do much with them, because actually outside of combat, I can't make them go somewhere specific. In combat, we can, and we'll see them in combat in a second, of course. We have 3 variants of them: a medic and support in the form of an engineer, and then also an assault guy that is kind of the beefy guy that also does overall the most damage. But then, for instance, the medic here can deploy a support station to revive allies and such, and the engineer has, of course, a turret. And this modifier as well, for doing certain actions, we're getting some bonuses, just part of the main modifier, before even looking at passives and such. And standouts in here are basically that, for instance, a companion kills a target you marked for attack. So actually, if we target something for it, we gain 25% weapon handling for 12 seconds. On the damage end of things, this is actually one of the bigger ones, where crossfire kills you and your companion damage and kill the same enemy. So if we just both have hit the same enemy and they die from one source, we will get 25% crit chance for 12 seconds. This doesn't seem to raise the crit cap in the way that some other things did. This is just 25% crit chance. And it is for 12 seconds, so it's not the longest of durations. These are not the long-term buffs that we've seen from some modifiers. And honestly, 25 weapon handling, 25 crit chance, 20 reload, 15 weapon damage for 5 seconds as well. That's one of the shorter ones. Or 35% bonus armor for 12 seconds, depending on things that we do. All of these are pretty timid in comparison to, let's say, By the Teeth, or for instance, Microwave Coils, or for instance, Zealot or such, or even the RPM increases of Year 7 Season 2. But that's, to me, also not too bad of a thing, because what we are getting is, alongside of us, that combatant, basically, they are a decoy. They work pretty well at that. You can target them onto enemies. And also, actually, for instance, with the assault guy, all of them have a decent amount of damage, but especially with the assault guy, you can kind of see it as having a 6-tier drone with similar amounts of health and armor basically to it. And yeah, as we see here, actually even much more than a drone, because yeah, they have 1 million health, 10 million armor here. And this is also based on a leveling system again, and that leveling system is per character, or no, not per character, per ally companion. And then it is account wide again, so that's nice. But then also we recruit these guys out in the wild. If we encounter any, we can recruit them. Each of them has 2 different traits attached to them. And those traits are actually per character. That one is per character. So the allies that you recruit is just for that character. So we will need to go around, and yeah, if you're likely, we'll figure out a meta in this, and then everybody will go likely for the same ones. But overall, these are actually somewhat effective, and because of that, that's kind of where the power lies within this season. The way that it also works in group is actually notable, where it is just 1 companion for the entire group, and basically each person can call in theirs, which is kind of annoying because you can just do so without really, especially if it's just with a random team, every person can kind of call theirs in basically with a 90-second cooldown in between. And yeah, that can kind of be annoying, but also whatever companion is out, they're kind of useful. They can only be commanded by the person in the group whose companion it is. So it is actually important to kind of have it be, on somebody that kind of knows what they're doing and maybe is actively making them target things and such. Because as we saw with the main modifier, yeah, for instance, having them target things and us killing them together, we get, of course, bonuses from that. And then, yeah, the companions themselves are that active modifier. So that system is just to swap between the classes that we get. And then we have a ton of passive modifiers. From here, there isn't that much that actually adds quite a bit of damage. One of the bigger ones, for instance, is this Shock and Advance, where after your companion uses their active, you gain both plus 20% movement speed and 15% rate of fire for 10 seconds. And that's one of the bigger ones in here. And of course, this season, most of the time we had closer to 30% rate of fire, and then we had Zealot or or Sanitation or things on top. Because yeah, there's a little bit for headshots, but there's also a lot of things in here, and we'll look into these in depth because also some of them may change in the future. But there are some things for making, for instance, your ally a little bit more tanky for when they take some damage. If they take 30% damage, they heal that back up and then gain a rate of fire bonus. And then this is just on a cooldown, especially so that they can still be downed. When they get to 0 health, actually, they do get downed and they don't die. You can still revive them. In a group setting, though, actually, if, for instance, my companion is out and they get downed, if I have a group member with me, they can actually activate theirs, and then that one pops in, and you don't actually have to go and revive them. So that might be one of those times to, for instance, actually use that system. But yeah, there isn't that much damage here, to a degree that actually we're not including them into the spreadsheets of here. We will actually make some, of course, for some of these things going forward into next seasons, once we have the final version and the final one in the game. I'll definitely do an in-depth look. In that one, we will look at some things, but yeah, there isn't that big of a damage grade here, because there is, for instance, yeah, 15% headshot. That's not that much. The 15% rate of fire, that is quite a bit, but that's, of course, also an on-kill, basically. And then together with that, it's also just on a 10-second timer and a 15-second cooldown. So, or that's with using your active, actually. So there is actually not that much power here, and I'm kind of okay with that. The hostile modifiers are actually not that invasive either. There is actually just one that kind of is, which is that they can have up to 40% damage resistance, and then also plus 25% damage. And this is also basically the one that then kind of makes it a little bit harder on some enemies. There is no regenning or such. They seem to have learned a lesson when it comes to that. But yeah, there is some damage resistances both from the Commander one and the Fire Team one. And there's actually this interesting one in the Jammer where they can provide some skill haste and such to us on deleting them, but they make it so that we gain command link slower, which is the resource that we use for the active on our allies. Overall, I am enjoying this modifier. Let's quickly see it in action for a second, and then we'll move on. And let's take our friend into a little bit of action just to show just the controls and how they can act. This is the assault one, and with all of them, you can just aim at an enemy target and then just they assault that one. It is kind of in the same way as a drone. Honestly, you can kind of see them as that. But yeah, with a lot more health, with a lot more armor, and actually a lot more damage. Interestingly, they do actually get affected by some choices that we make on our gear. One of the things that I'm not sure if it's intended or not, but it definitely is working that way in the PTS, is that, for instance, glass is transitive. So glass will apply to our ally as well. And of course, as we saw, as we kind of target enemies and such, or kill the same enemy together, we get, for instance, bonuses there. For instance, we got likely the rate of fire increase and such, or the crit chance increase, actually, I should say, as we killed the same enemy together. And they do an okay-ish amount of damage. It's not anything a lot, but yeah, it is a skill's worth, basically, but a 6-tier skill, like an actual drone builds drone, effectively. They sometimes can be a little bit annoying in trying to get them to actually target the thing that you want them to target. And here I'm going to use their active, and let's see how good that works out for us, which is their rocket launcher. Yeah, he's really thinking about it. He's thinking about it. Well, somewhat effective. And that one, for instance, can be very effective in if you get a spawn with it, of course, in the same way that for instance, actually we have a random here as well. As for instance, the same as a grenade launcher could be or such. The medic has a support station, the engineer has a turret. The engineer's one, in the PTS, we're going to really test it. It seems very wonky and doesn't really want to work out well. The support station from the medic can actually be very useful, and yeah, has actually decent healing properties. Nothing too excessive. It's not like having an FI healer, but it can also, for instance, do cleansing, which is, for instance, hazard protection-wise, pretty interesting. What we see here as well, actually, is that in the world, we'll have random ones just popping up they'll be engaging enemies. They'll be in, for instance, activities like this. And the way that this system works is that we can recruit them to our side. But at any one time, we can have only one medic, one tech line, well, one quick fix, one tech line, one spearhead, as they call them. But yeah, medic, engineer, or assault. And their traits are listed here. And once we have one, so for instance, in the case, I already have a medic, but now we can, instead of the one that I have, which has low profile and contingency response, we can take instead cool-headed here and combat stimulants. And if we recruit this guy, this basically overwrites the other guy that we have. And with these traits, it's going to become likely over time we'll go like, oh, these two are pretty good to have. Or actually maybe in several ways we'll find useful ways to have them be. And yeah, a meta will emerge. We'll go for those. And this one is per character. So when I recruit this one, this medic here, on this character, it is only on this character. The levels are account-wide, but the recruiting isn't. Which is kind of understandable. That way you can also, if you have dedicated, you might want to have one where you're more aggressive than some other one, and you want another one to be more tanky than another one. You can have that across characters. But yeah, that one now becomes the traits of my medic as we recruited them. And yeah, this system is partially a little clunky in play, as with drones, as with just allies in general, as we see them in gameplay. Sometimes they listen, sometimes they don't, and I've had quite often with this guy especially trying to use their active and it just goes somewhere else, or basically he takes forever to fire. As we saw there, he didn't fire instantly. It took a little bit of time. Sometimes it takes no time, sometimes it takes a little bit of time. And of course makes quite a difference in their consistency. But overall, it is an interesting mechanic. It is, as far as mechanics go, something different than we've seen so far, and I've quite enjoyed it so far. The one thing they definitely do need to change is how verbose they are. As a tip, and this you can do just in case they come to the game in this form until they kind of change it, their dialogue is part of dialogue volume. You can't just turn off the dialogue volume to 0 and they will stop yapping, but so will Isaac, and so will Manny, and so will everything else. So it is kind of, it kind of robs the world a little bit of some of the chatter and stuff, which I quite enjoy. And also the callouts from enemies of, sending a grenade or I'm going to go flank and stuff like that. All of those also disappear. So those can be pretty handy to have. So hopefully they'll give us either just make them shut up a little bit, because I feel for trained soldiers, we get to say how much they get to yell. Otherwise, just having a toggle for them might be useful. But yeah, the modifier overall, it is pretty interesting. It is definitely not as powerful as last season's, but I would also hope nothing that we get is going to be as powerful as we got there. As yeah, that season was very OP, and I've been actually enjoying going to just playing around and not feeling super overpowered, even though actually gear-wise we're getting a little bit of upgrades and such. Let's already go and start looking at that. And moving on to the weapons and gears, we'll start with the exotics here, and then we'll go to the Gearset and Brandset. Here, the Bittersweet rifle. It is a Bittersweet Symphony called this rifle. The best kind of double-edged, and this is a classic M1A at its core. It has the same base damage as a classic M1A. Same RPM. The max size is 20, where because of the mods, it gets to have plus 10 rounds, where normally, of course, we only get plus 5. For the rest of it, it is actually an interesting rifle because alongside of its just base stats, it has transfusion, and transfusion is kind of an idea that I've always kind of went like, yeah, they should totally do that, which is shooting your allies to heal them. Because yeah, hitting headshot builds stacks up to a max of 8. When shooting an ally or skill, repair them for 50% of the shot's damage for each stack. Healed allies will receive 50%, although actually in the patch notes, as it stated, it is 200% of your repair skills bonus as bonus armor for each stack for 10 seconds. And this can do actually a lot of bonus armor. But then also, if we are at full stacks, all hits are guaranteed headshots for 8 seconds after healing an ally or skill while at maximum stacks. So every time we do a headshot, we gain a stack up to 8. If we use it at 8 stacks, we gain this bonus of all hits are guaranteed headshots. And interestingly, this is even true, for instance, things like warhounds or turrets or such. We normally wouldn't have a head, but you still deal guaranteed headshot damage to them. Same is true as actually for helmeted enemies. This isn't determined in that way where it's putting the damage to the head. No, if you hit the body, you're doing headshot damage, and because of that, you can just drop them pretty effectively. The repair skill leading into bonus armor makes it so that you could actually use this, for instance, on Vi or such as bonus armor. On the other hand, the healing is based on the damage that you do with the weapon. And that, of course, actually leans more towards, for instance, using it from a red build. Although we could, of course, hybridize and such, and that'll be the interesting thing to do with this, is to find a good hybrid way to, for instance, have some weapon damage, have some repair skill, and then, yeah, for instance, have the healing be pretty plentiful. Although I have to say that just, yeah, even on a red build, if we are at full 8 stacks, we heal up an ally, even with, for instance, a blue core or 2 up to full pretty easily, because, yeah, this is an M1A and this can hit hard. So 50% per stack, that actually adds up to quite a lot. It is actually also visually an interesting rifle, as yeah, it is an M1A, but then with a drum mag and yeah, some embroidery on top by the look of things, and a pretty hefty suppressor. The way then that it works in the game is that whenever we hit a headshot, so here, the second I hit that headshot, we see on my buff bar, I have a new icon there. That is the rifle's talent. And as we get more and more headshots, we build that up. And if we, at 8 stacks, shoot an ally, then we get that bonus. So here, for instance, I could put out a skill or something, and then, for instance, shoot that, and we'll do that actually. And that'll eat up our stacks. As we see there, now it's a timed one that is going down. All my shots in this duration that hit an enemy will do headshot damage to wherever I shoot them. And then once it runs out, it runs out. One of the things is, as you may have noticed there, I'm back at full stacks, and that is because after I started, all of these shots are actually building up the next stack. And as you can see, we can get way more than 8 shots in there really quickly, meaning that once you get it going, if you do it right and trigger it at the right timings and then start shooting the enemy, you can actually make it so that you can cycle and cycle and cycle. As we'll see in the numbers in a second, this can be really powerful. The downsides of it is a classic M1A. We are giving up, of course, on a talent. Mods-wise, it is only with 2 headshot mods, and then that rounds, plus 10 rounds. Doesn't have a crit chance going here for it, but of course that headshot feeds into its talent quite a bit. I have tried it out in several ways. Definitely headhunting comes to mind and kind of works for that, but actually I've tended to go just much more the crit chance, crit damage kind of route. Although it will be interesting to play around with it and maybe make a build that is centered around, let's say, maybe a red FI, but then with headshot as as the stat that we go for. One of the things is, though, that it being a classic M1A, while you can kind of just fire at decent distances and still kind of land those headshots as need be, especially unless it is at a very close range, trying to just spam fire it at full RPM, it can work, but it's not as effective as you would want it to be. A little bit of weapon handling can help there, especially, for instance, using it on a thing like Umbra, which has actually been the build I've been mostly using it on, because, of course, yeah, rifles work pretty well on this. We might, especially at this full RPM, kind of want some maybe extra handling if we're going this route. The thing is, though, that one thing we can also do is just close the distance a little bit more and then, yeah, really be aggressive with it. And then, of course, intermediately, we'll go and shoot an ally, heal them up, and of course the companion counts for this, of course, for this season. But actually, yeah, using it on teammates is even more powerful. And in that time, we'll build up the next stack and so forth and so forth. It actually does work out pretty well. One of the bigger downsides of it is, and we'll actually just do that here, is if I go out of combat, which leaving there, of course, we do. Actually, here in the range, yeah, no, there it goes. It does not keep the stacks. So whenever we go out of combat, it does no longer keep its stacks into the next fight. That means that you, in each fight, have to build it up. You can't kind of keep it at 8 stacks ready for the next fight. The second we leave out of, exit combat, it drops its stacks. And that does actually hurt it quite a bit in gameplay. Let's go look at its numbers. And we'll come to the spreadsheet here. I'll link, of course, to the main spreadsheet in the description down below. All of these are in here. This one is a little bit lower down. And in here, we're going to look at comparing the Bittersweet to some of the other weapons that we could pick, of course, but with a damage talent, just to kind of show the difference that it can make. Because, of course, here, the big thing of it is it's kind of a utility talent. And here we're putting it on a high-end glass. This one is actually with Sacrifice, Gift, Overdogs, and then 2 pieces Via and a Fox's Prayer. That's the layout we're kind of going here for this comparison. And the Bittersweet, just by itself, is actually putting out a decent amount. If we actually take away Killer from some of these other weapons as we have them here, we see that, for instance, just the classic M1A is just a little bit ahead, and that's just down to, of course, that it gets to have 2 crit chance mod slots. And with that, it actually pushes out ahead a little bit. Here, though, we're actually keeping it at 1 crit chance, 1 crit damage mod on that weapon, just to use the same build, both for the Bittersweet and some of these other items. But, of course, all of the high ends get to have that crit chance mod to push it up a little bit. Without the damage talent or a damage talent active. So instead, if we were just using, let's say, preservation, although preservation would of course be personal healing, with this you cannot heal yourself. You can only heal others or your skills. And damage-wise, we're just a little bit over 5% behind the classic M1A. So damage-wise, this thing can actually hold up, except of course the second damage talent comes into play. Then yeah, it falls a little bit behind, but of course it has a very interesting trait that we can use, and its healing is strong enough, because of course we also have the Dr. Home. The big issue with the Dr. Home is that it requires kills, and that really changes the metrics of things. Because we need kills with the Dr. Home, where this just needs headshot, we can't use it, for instance, in parts where actually healing matters more, where for instance, boss fights or such. This can be used. Also, with the bonus armor that this has, it can actually effectively keep someone upright, because the bonus armor will take a little bit of time for the enemies to eat through unless they're getting shot by something really big. And because of that, they might regain their health gate. And that is actually, of course, one of the main things with healing, is that really what matters is that the health gate is there. And if they're getting 1 shot to health gate, even if you heal them back to full, that doesn't matter if the second shot comes through and just, drops them to the ground. That bonus armor, though, then can make that difference, because with that bonus armor, that's big enough that actually, even a sniper shot, unless you're running, maybe let's say you're running the new knee pads, then yeah, that might hurt a little bit more if you have blacklisters on. But for a large part, we can actually, especially with that bonus armor, keep people upright. Because if nothing else, you always even have a little bit of repair skill just from your watch points, of course. If we kind of look at here a Classic M1A, a Mark 17, and a 6 CQB, just in comparison, yeah, all of them are a little bit ahead, and that's just down to their mods, of course. All of them are also decent ahead on the sustain, especially once we trigger Killer here alongside of it. Yeah, that's going to push it to basically be, for instance, here with the Classic M1A, it'd be 23% ahead, and that's really a lot of difference, of course. Killer, really good for rifles and such anyway, because you just need a kill. It's not RPM dependent or things like that. Also in here, I've put in a Lexington just to kind of compare Lexington to kind of the rifles, and actually, especially with the top-end rifles, they can kind of keep up, especially on the high-end versus a Lexington. But then, of course, what the Lexington kind of will be in line for more is that rifles just don't have the RPM for instance, some of the bigger builds, like, for instance, Striker. And that's really where they hurt a little bit. But actually, as we see here, yeah, the Bittersweet, well, we're giving up a bunch of damage. It isn't insane amounts. It isn't completely unusable because, yeah, it is a decent weapon underneath. And especially mitigating that, adding 5 rounds here and mitigating that very small magazine of the Classic Money helps out a little bit here. What we also need to look at, and that's what we have down here, is that if we have that bonus active for 10 seconds, getting all of the headshots, once we go into 100% headshot, and this is basically, of course, with all of these calculations, we'll look at it mostly at 20% headshot rate and then a 60% armor rate, which here just will matter for the Lexington difference here. But when it comes to the Bittersweet, of course, we have a way of guaranteeing every body shot to be in headshot for that 10 seconds. It is actually way ahead against a killer variant, because this is a Classic Money with killer versus the Bittersweet with its talent, with that section active. What we see here, and what that basically does is just, yeah, take the headshot rate to 100%, where we're keeping it at 20% rate for the Classic Money. If we're, of course, kind of comparing them both at 100% headshot rate, that killer one definitely is going to win. But of course, if we're kind of take it like, yeah, with that one, we're hitting 20%, but here we're just hitting body shots and we're gaining that damage bonus from our headshot multiplier. Yeah, that actually is way far ahead of killer. So actually, if you're using this in very optimal ways, you could actually likely squeeze out, because you have to remember, for this, we still need to, for instance, find an ally, shoot them, and then go back to your target. That damage loss in reacquiring targets, reacquiring your ally, and then such, that's going to be way more than this 13% difference. But you could likely match up to a killer Classic M1A, and that's plenty, together with healing, together with the bonus armor. So I think this item really is interesting, and I'm looking forward actually to making dedicated builds for this and looking at how we can kind of min-max it, because of course, yeah, we could just max out headshot plus reload speed and really try to go for the heads, maybe put some weapon handling in to make that effective. And of course, we have the brand bonuses to do that with Zuia, with things like Overlord. So it'll be interesting to see what comes out of this in the end. But by itself, this is definitely usable, and I've actually quite enjoyed running around with this. Although actually the build that I kind of would recommend for it, although not with this backpack, as yeah, this is just the backpack that normally is equipped on it, but either going with, of course, a new Brandset or with a Cheska backpack, and taking Umbra. Umbra is really good for rifles, and while, for instance, we often also say OD is really good for rifles, that's really, you really need Sadist there. That leaves especially Umbra as a really good pick for this, or just going high-end. Let's move on to the next one. Next up, we'll go to Bacon with the E, Beacon. This new exotic chest is with the flavor text, with me! And yeah, this is in line, of course, with its talent here. It does come with a red core and crit chance and crit damage. That was actually very important, of course, to this. And yeah, it does get those, because without those, as always, like if we have to deal with a stat that isn't per se in line with damage, we'll have to kind of calculate it in that way. Here it has crit chance, crit damage, especially for crit builds, it can go in there. Although I would have maybe seen it be workable with a skill tier and repair skill, skill haste, to maybe use, for instance, with things like MA especially. You wouldn't, of course, in an FI build, in a future initiative build, you wouldn't take it, but with measured assembly, I could use this as a chest for that. But I can also see it in the red side, except that, as we'll see in the numbers in a bit, this doesn't work out well enough. But before we spoil that, Bond is its talent. Both you and your allies receive plus 20% crit damage, plus 10% skill efficiency, and plus 1% armor regen when an ally is within 10 meters of you. But also receive, not also, either that or receive 10% crit damage, 5% skill efficiency, and 0.5% armor regen when one of your skills is within 10 meters of you. Only the highest group of buffs can be active at one time, so either or is between these two, and only one of them can be active at a time. And this is actually because I was curious as to, when I saw the text on this, on if it has to be one ally within your range and then both you and allies receive, because that would mean that the other two could be far enough away, just in case like two people are close together, it gives the buff and then everybody gets it. But no, that's actually not how it works. It's only to people within 10 meters. Within the PTS, there seems to be some oddity as well, where at the very least, two of them can become active, because we've seen that with the armor regen being 2% if multiple of us equip it. The weird thing is that if even 3 of us equip it, only 2 still seem to be active. So we only get 2% regen at most, and also 2 times 20% crit damage at most. So there's some oddity there, and I hope they fix that before release. But also, even then, that's still not per se that workable. This 20% crit damage is, of course, working up against this being a chest piece, up against very big talents. Things like, for instance, the new Perfect Obliterate that we're getting, or Glass, or Focus are way bigger than this, of course. But this can be group-wide. But I still think that there are better choices to be had here, and it becomes an opportunity cost thing. Because while we do have a crit damage, we also have skill efficiency and that regen. That regen can be very nice, of course, but it is that 10-meter range, which is actually pretty hard to kind of get going. In general gameplay, unless you're really coordinating well, in a lot of places that just doesn't happen. You just don't have two people within 10 meters. Of course, going through some of the smaller missions, if you're running through Lincoln, yeah, you might be. But even there are plenty of places where you're getting far enough away that this is not going to be active. And then if we're kind of looking at it in that way, things like Overwatch and such kind of come into the picture as well. Even though they have other requirements, you need to be in cover for Overwatch, but everybody gets it independent of range. And of course, yeah, actually a little bit more damage than 20% crit damage, because it's giving total weapon damage. This piece is kind of lackluster, and I could see it maybe getting a buff before it comes to the live game. Let's actually go look at it at its numbers. And we'll come to this multi-calculator where we're keeping it a little bit simple. We're looking at it here with the Equilizer. We'll see that one in a minute by itself. The Equilizer being the new chest from Unit Alloys, and it is Perfect Obliterate. So if we take Perfect Obliterate plus Salvo, which is the new high-end or named knee pads, where it has also rate of fire. As we'll see in a little bit, that will be kind of a baseline build that we'll be comparing a lot with going forward, not just for this PTS, but if the stats stay as they are, that's going to be the general, just, you know, without exotics in their meta. At least for ARs. If we, for instance, then, instead of the Equalizer, take the Beacon together with the Salvo, on a Strikers build, of the other pieces being Strikers, looking effectively like the build that we saw a second ago in the game. If we have the Ally buff, because there's of course 2 buffs to it, there's the Ally buff or the Skill buff. The Skill buff is basically half values of the Ally buff. You would definitely, if using this, you want to kind of use it as the Ally buff, because otherwise it is especially weak. If we go with this, because we're dropping Perfect Obliterate, we're losing quite a lot of damage here. Even though we're getting that, if we had an ally within range, we're losing about 20% of our damage, a little over even. And that is too big of an ask. Now, of course, this is giving a group buff, so in the same way as, for instance, Coyote and such, we have to kind of consider that as well, and we'll look at that in a second. But the ask here is, I feel, too much already. It is definitely too low for it to be considered, because also you have to remember, in a group setting, it becomes, if one person is dropping way too much damage, the group as a whole, you have basically a DPS as the group, and if one person is dropping to buff the others, the buff needs to be enough to kind of make up for how much they themselves lose. In this case, I feel this player is losing more than the group is gaining, really, realistically. And yeah, overall, I feel this definitely could use a buff, but we're here only looking at the damage component. we have to consider that we also have skill efficiency in there, and we have armor regen in there. And that does make it a little bit more of a, yeah, it kind of muddies the waters if we're kind of just looking at it just from a damage perspective. So do keep that in mind. But even then, I think the damage could be bumped up a little bit higher just to make this competitive in a little bit more of a sense. Because also, of course, it is an exotic. It will eat up the exotic slot that we have available. And yeah, there especially is kind of the issue, because we have now such powerful exotics in, for instance, the Tinkerer and, for instance, in Overdogs, that here, as we'll see later on, the Equalizer plus Salvo combo is actually pretty far behind even. On top of that, for instance, if we're just going Equalizer plus Overdogs, especially when Overdogs is active. But even if we kind of average Overdogs out, it's still pretty far behind. But then also what we kind of have to look at is if we take those same set of numbers here into a second set as we have them here, we have the Equalizer plus Salvo, just as the 100% again, and then we're comparing them to basically our teammates. So our teammates running Equalizer plus Salvo, and then, you know, or somebody else is basically running the beacon, as I want to call it, bacon over and over again. But the beacon is now on somebody else. What do we gain if we're close to them? Because we gain that 20% crit damage, of course. We gain that regen. That regen by itself is also decent. Thing is, though, that 1% regen by itself, 1% regen means that over 100 seconds is needed, or well, 100 seconds is needed to go from empty armor to full. This is one of the ways to kind of look at armor regen is 2% armor regen is 50 seconds, 3% armor regen is 33 seconds, 4% armor regen is 25 seconds. And especially as you're pushing it down, for instance, especially jumping from 1% to 2%, cutting it in half, going from 100 seconds to 50 seconds, makes it a lot more bearable. 33 seconds especially, which for instance, the 3% for Memento is actually pretty healthy. But 1% by itself is just too slow to really make an impact. But of course, that could be added to running Bellstone or such. But here we then see that, yeah, once we have that, with the beacon on an ally, the striker build here is gaining a little under 6%. Yeah, 5.64% there. But there is another. As Yoda once said. There is another, and that's in Overwatch. Overwatch on the chest. So here, instead of taking the beacon there, if we had an ally alongside of us that was running Overwatch, and Overwatch, of course, will be 14%, or actually in this case, where you're running normal Overwatch, which is 12%. We could be running, or the other person could be running Ferocious Calm, which is 14% even. So we're not even taking the higher version of Overwatch here. But just even with normal Overwatch, not perfect, the Striker build is gaining from that. On ourselves, we're gaining about 9.68%. That is a much bigger value, especially on the damage end, but that's also... Well, while it isn't the skill efficiency, it is also total skill damage. It is total weapon damage, total skill damage for Overwatch. We're not getting the regen, but honestly, I would much rather have this extra damage, especially without the range limitation, and the only limitation being just that that ally is in cover for the time needed, 10 seconds or 8 seconds. Well, 8 seconds for the perfect. But that seems just a much better value proposition, especially at the cost of an exotic slot and such. And that's why I think this beacon could use a little bit of buffing. I would think that maybe actually just putting a little bit more towards the crit damage and the skill efficiency would maybe already be enough to make that a little bit more viable. Because by itself, as it stands now, especially that range as well, is kind of limiting. But also that could maybe be changed to maybe be closer to 20 meters or such, and then keeping the same stats maybe. But yeah, some ways that they could alter this, but as it stands here, I think just an Overwatch chest is much more easy to stick in there. And then also the player that is running that can, for instance, run things like Tinkerer, things like Overdogs, things like Centurion, which are then much bigger damage bonuses as well. So overall, this is the one that kind of is a little bit undertuned. And yeah, let's move it on to the Sheriff, where we'll get to shoot the Sheriff. But yeah, hands off the Deputy. And as its flavor text, it's about to get real, but actually this is fake. because this is actually just the Super 90, as you may have noticed here. The graphics and the look of the item is not actually in the PTS, which is not uncommon for PTS to kind of happen without the final versions of the items there. So this is just placeholder art, effectively. So yeah, don't look at that. Well, I'm looking forward to actually seeing what this sheriff in the end gets to look like. And yeah, it is a Super 90 underneath everything. It is the same base damage as, or no, it isn't the same base damage. It is 35% more base damage than a normal Super 90. The RPM and the max size are the same. The headshot multiplier is the same. But then also its optimal range is heavily increased, basically up to the cap of 100 there. Of course, we can, this will be the climax item. One of the things is, so actually here I have a crit damage one. I've been testing it with a detox one on a different character. But this, of course, again, is going to be a climax item. And there is already a blueprint, at least it seems to be in the files. So hopefully we will get a blueprint for this. In the PTS here, we didn't have it yet. The interesting thing would be then, yeah, this is kind of, again, like the Tempest, we kind of need that blueprint so we can just reroll them. They should not make us, you know, go through the hell that was, for instance, getting the Tempest with detox. And then here, as its talent is basically its stats that we discussed a second ago. So it has plus 35% weapon damage, but this isn't weapon damage, and they should have actually been clearer in here. This is plus 35% base weapon damage. So its base damage is actually increased by 35%, and that effectively makes it a 35% amp. So it isn't adding to the weapon damage of the build, it is just the base is increased by 35%. And because nothing else interacts with that and it's just multiplying against everything else in that way, it's just going to be a 35% damage increase. It has a plus 100% accuracy, but 100% accuracy doesn't mean 100% accurate. That's not how that stat works. It's basically taking the radius of the accuracy and it's just decreasing it by 100%, so halving it basically. And that means that it is a lot more accurate than a lot of other shotguns, but it isn't pinpoint accurate. It has no damage drop-off, and that's just been done by setting the optimal range to 100 meters. And 100 meters is also basically our cap for doing damage. As we can see here, our damage drop-off is just at the top, and then at 100 meters, it drops off all the way. Basically, hit registration ends at 101 meters. Whenever you shoot enemies beyond that, you actually get a pop-up of immune for a few meters, and then basically the hit doesn't register at all. And yeah, these bonuses are built into the weapon's base stats. The thing of note here is that this doesn't have mods to go with it, and that does mean that on the weapon damage end here, of course, on a normal Super 90, we could have a damage talent. That could be a part of this, but also we would have 2 crit chance mods, or we could go headshot, for instance, but generally crit chance mods, and then also 20% reload in the magazine slot. All of those can't be had here, so we are just getting that 35%, but that actually turns out to be, honestly, a little bit too much, as we'll see in a second, because yeah, it is exceeding some other weapons, and honestly, for a large part, it's making a lot of weapons kind of unneeded. I think because of also the other things that it has, it stands to lose a little bit of this weapon damage. Let's go actually look at it in the numbers. And for that, we'll come to this multi-calculator where we're putting it onto a Hunter's Fury here to compare it against some of the other shotguns. Layout-wise, this build is then just this Hunter's Fury, as is also on the build collection, the Shotgun Hunter's Fury, with Intimidate, Adrenaline Rush, Cheska Grupo combo there, with the Sheriff in there, and then yeah, filling it up with some Hunter's Fury pieces. There's a thing to be said here that Hunter's Fury, especially this weapon kind of being dedicated to having extreme ranges, doesn't align well with Hunter's Fury, but we're just using it as its base there, of course. And of course, we kind of want to see, damage-wise, how the Sheriff holds up against especially talents on some of the other weapons. And here we have the Sheriff as our baseline, effectively. Then looking at the Super 90 here with no mods on it, so if we're just taking the base weapon, we don't put mods on there, and especially looking at the base damage of it. Now, of course, here we're kind of looking at it in the wrong way, going down, and of course, that's going to be a smaller number than going up, the way that percentages work. If we kind of flip it the other way around and go like, how much is this more than that one, then it is 135%. Now, of course, we could just take the base and compare those by, by their number. You don't need to calculate it all the way out to a build for this, but here we can see that it is at 35% in the up. And that's, of course, important because quite often we've had either weird things there. First, of course, confirming that it isn't all weapon damage. It is basically a separate multiplier, and it is just the base damage that is so much higher. But also, yeah, sometimes they've gone like, we've adjusted this 10%, and then we test it, and it's 11%. And yeah, we need to make sure that that lines up. Once we start adding in some of the mods and such, so for instance, with the Super 90, we can of course put 2 crit chance mods on there and then a plus 20% reload. And what we especially see then is that it catches up quite a bit more to this sheriff. And it is now quite below that 35%, of course. On the sustain, it catches up more because we're also adding 20% reload there, where, yeah, the sheriff is basically just taking the base amount here with the watch on top. And this, of course, has the watch plus 20% from that magazine slot 20%. So the sustain actually catches up way more. If we then start looking at like glue, of course, perfect brazen as we have it, both at 4 stacks, 6 stacks, and 8 stacks, all 3 versions present here. What we see there is that it is actually quite in the favor of this sheriff. And this is kind of an issue, I feel. If the brazen needs to hit an enemy with 8 pellets or a kill, if you get a kill, you get full stacks with brazen. And then for the next shot, it has 101%, where this sheriff has and the accuracy and the optimal range and also that damage. That's too much, in my opinion. And I feel actually that it is very kind of overtuned on this one. And I do have a recommendation here at the end that we'll discuss in a second, but especially as well, brazen, of course, is one of the bigger damage talents here. And by itself, it's at full stacks is a 28% amp, and that's also, of course, what is happening here. Just that crit chances mods on top, and this 28%, it puts it just a little bit ahead of that sheriff. Pummel by itself, of course, just being weapon damage increase, 40% of it, but just going into this all weapon damage category. Because of that, it actually doesn't keep up, of course, with either brazen or the sheriff. But of course, Pummel has that handiness where, yeah, we can basically get it to reload for us, especially on the tsunami. That's a really good place to use it. But if we are taking the Pummel and here adding in the reload as well, and basically just taking the reload away, just going like, we're always triggering Pummel, which in reality, it's doable, but yeah, not when you run into a named, for instance, or such. If we were doing that though, the sustain, of course, is tremendous. And because of that, it can actually go way over. And that's actually, I think, the way to kind of balance this thing out. Because as we discussed, yeah, it doesn't have those mods. It doesn't have that 20% reload speed mod. I would be way in favor of this thing losing a little bit of damage, but gaining in its reload speed. Even more so maybe than it just won that one mod. Because here we see as well, Killer, one of the bigger talents here as well. Yeah, it is smaller than Brazen. That was already known. But then, yeah, here, of course, yeah, it's not keeping up. On the sustain end, though, both of the Brazen, Brazen and Killer can kind of keep up. Brazen can actually extend a little bit away from it, and that's just because of that reload mod. So here would be my recommendation, and that is to bring it in line damage-wise with the other things, and then maybe give it some reload speed to make up for that. Because actually now it is actually, while it feels powerful, it also feels tedious because that reload is actually really painful. It is quite a difference to go from that 3.56 to that 4.23, that you do feel that. And of course, this will be used on, if it is, for instance, used on Thunder's Fury. And in this case, there is no reason not to, right? It's just better. It is basically always active Brazen. And that's, of course, the thing as well. Brazen, you need to activate it. Killer, you need to activate it. Pummel, you need to activate it. This is always on. Taking it down to 25% on the base, and this is basically us just taking that same number, 25% on the base, adding that reload, 20% to the reload on this weapon, we get these numbers out of it. Now here on the side, actually, we're comparing against this Sheriff as a 25. If it was 25, what would it compare to with the other things? And we see that actually, yeah, now things like the Brazen, for instance, with full stacks is about 10% ahead. Killer is 5% ahead on the burst. They wouldn't be as far ahead on sustain. They would basically be about the same amounts. But this puts it behind basically just a little bit. This will put it at basically 5 stacks of Brazen. And that's still very good because this is, of course, always active. And then it has that accuracy. And then it has that optimal range. So I feel with those things combined, it really could use the stand to not push out all of these weapons. Because what it currently will do is just, with the only exception being that if you're already wanting to use a different exotic, so for instance, if you want to really go with, let's say, especially for instance on Striker as a secondary, for instance, instead of the ACS, this would be a really good pick and a little bit too good actually for that. And it will push out basically things like Glue, things like the Tsunami, basically all of the high ends, more DPS related shotguns will just see no use at all because this is the de facto go-to. The only reason would be to, for instance, go with Tinkerer, which in some cases really does make a difference. For instance, with ODs with shotguns, going Tinkerer and then going Sadist plus Pummel is a really good combo. But even there, yeah, that's kind of like trying to find the outlier where this thing isn't better than every other shotgun there. Because for headhunting, we'll still use other shotguns. This thing is as well. For headhunting, it still doesn't have high enough of a base damage, even at this 35% to really compete with the M870 and things like this, things like the SPOS 12. But it basically completely removes the high-end crit-based kind of shotguns from the field. And I don't think that's really healthy for the game. The only thing is with some of those shotguns, yeah, you could take, for instance, a Light Glue and then take a Scorpio for survivability, but do you need survivability if you have just so much more damage? I think taking this thing down to 25% and then adding in some reload speed, maybe even more than this to kind of satisfy that it is, you know, better still in some ways than most, makes it so that things like the Light Glue are still, if you just can land all those pellets and such and can get that damage out, same for Killer, where you do need to kill to activate it, but then you have a little bit more damage, could make those make sense while still giving this a place, because this, for consistency, will of course be, you can't match it because it will always have that 25% and then just has the accuracy and then also the optimal range on top. So yeah, I do hope they kind of address this one. Let's start moving on to some other things, as we'll go to Unit Alloys, which is the new brand set for this season, together with 2 named items that it'll come with, and actually we'll discuss those very much in depth. We're going to go kind of deep into this one already a little bit, because this is of course the interesting one. First off, Unit Alloys, it comes with 5% rate of fire as its first brand bonus, 20% assault rifle damage as its second brand bonus, and 50% magazine size as its third brand bonus. This breaks actually a little bit of an ongoing tradition with brand bonuses where they have weapon damages on second and third pieces, where especially if we, for instance, think to things like Lengmo or such, they have basically non-damage focused brand bonuses on the first and second piece, and then the third piece is then the LMG bonus. Same, for instance, with Zvia. Zvia has, for instance, magazine size, which is still DPS related, but more sustained DPS related, not burst DPS. And then on the second piece, it has 20% assault rifle damage. Same, for instance, for things as well, actually, even with Imminence Armaments, even though that first piece has 5% weapon damage, that's pretty low. And then the 60% weapon damage or pistol damage is actually on the 3-piece. Walker Harris was, of course, one of the ones that did have this, but then Walker Harris on the first piece had 5% weapon damage, which was actually much lower than the 10% that you would get from a specific weapon one, of course, and then the second piece was also 5% damage to armor, which is also pretty low in comparison to what of some of the other sources. And then actually just its third piece is somewhat okay in 10% DTH. Here we're getting 5% rate of fire and 20% assault rifle as 2 pieces in a row. So the way that you can kind of see this, as well as we quite often do with, for instance, Lengmo, is, for instance, with Lengmo, you can see it as 10% LMG damage, 10% LMG damage, 10% LMG damage, and then you get those other things, the other brand bonuses kind of on top. that explosive resistance and whatever it has as a second piece that nobody cares about. Here, of course, though, that's still the case. We're getting 20% assault rifle damage here, so effectively 10% assault rifle damage, 10% assault rifle damage. But then, instead of something, but for instance, even with Zvia, we're getting magazine size, 20% of it. It's not the biggest bonus there. It's not that super effective. 5% rate of fire is. 5% rate of fire is actually quite competitive with Cheska. And then the second piece is much bigger than basically any of the brand bonuses that we have there. And then especially with the two pieces there together, yeah, that's a lot. And to me, this is kind of power creepy. And yeah, power creepy, I find creepy. So I'd rather not. I don't think they can really walk it back at this point, but it would have been nice to have that consideration there that, oh, for all of the other things, we're not doing it this way. We shouldn't put two damage bonuses after each other. As actually, when this got announced on, on their stream, I actually did a full face palm, and yeah, that's not the reaction you want out of me, I feel. This is, because of that, really potent, and then especially on top of that, we get some of the named pieces, as there are, as often as always with brands nowadays, we get two names with them. On the first one, here, the chest, the Equilizer, building them up to bring them down. Oh, well, that may have been a little bit too much on the nose with some things being brought up. Maybe to bring them down, but nah, I wouldn't hope to think so. This is a red core set. That is actually important to note, as that makes it a lot easier, of course, to farm, especially for us going for red builds and such. This perfect obliterate that it has as this named item. Critical hits increase total weapon damage by 1% for 10 seconds, stacks up to 24 times. Now, of course, normal obliterate stacks up to 20 times. This is 4% extra total weapon damage, which increases our damage by a chunky amount. It isn't the full 4%, that should actually be noted, because yeah, this is basically 4% additive to a 20%, so it's a little bit less than that if we're comparing it in that way. But it is still an increase to the damage of Obliterate, and it's on one of the better gear set or brand sets, and that combination is also not something that I think is really thought through. So one of the things that quite often people bitch about, to me incorrectly, is, for instance, they go like, oh, why did they put Perfect Spotter on a brand that is not damage related? Why do they put, certain damage related things on build? And the reason is that you can balance them out that way. So for instance, Perfect Spotter is actually usable if you have high enough weapon damage, and especially with grading on top, Perfect Spotter actually beats out normal Spotter. Putting Perfect Obliterate on one of the better brands now for damage, so for instance, in the same way of like putting it on Cheska or Grupo, is a bad idea, because you create a best in slot, and that actually hurts build diversity. One of the things in the past was actually with high-ends, before Striker was the meta. High-ends basically had the best in slot in Fox's Prayer. That knee pad slot, you didn't even need to farm anything for it. If you got a good knee pad, just toss it away. If you got a full God roll, Cheska, crit chance, crit damage, red weapon core, all maxed out, nice piece, it won't leave the stash. I don't think that is healthy for the build diversity. And it was actually kind of nice that, for instance, because of the shift to strikers and some of the gear sets, basically Fox's Prayer kind of lost its place there, especially because it needed high crit to be there already for it to be the best in slot. Which, for instance, with Striker and such, especially with Killer and such on top, really wasn't the case anymore. But then, yeah, we're creating a best in slot here. And I'm not the biggest fan of those, especially because they have a different route they could have gone here. This is a stacks up to 24 times, but he could have also played with this time on it. This 1% for 10 seconds, that 10 seconds actually does fall away. Now, of course, in the past, one of the bigger buffs to Obliterate was actually taking it from 5 seconds to 10 seconds. And honestly, to me, that was more impactful than the buff way before it of taking it from 15 to 25, but still being 5 seconds duration. And of course, recently they took it, well, recently, at this point, more than a year ago. With Project Resolve, they took it from 25 to 20, kept it at 10 seconds, and that kind of was actually quite balanced, I would say. They're basically reintroducing the old version with 1% less here. And I feel they could have gone the route of just adding in 10 extra seconds here or 5 extra seconds there. And that would have actually been still a substantial buff to obliterate, but wouldn't have made it so that basically if we're going obliterate, there is no other choice here. From one side, that is also not too bad because actually as a new player starting out, we can just say go farm the Equalizer and yeah, you basically, the talent is already there. It is easier than, for instance, a free talentable Cheska chest to get because you just need the weapon damage there, the crit or the crit chance or crit damage there, and then just, you know, you put the other one missing, or even you might find the crit chance, crit damage one, and then find the recore and then just recore it or core it so you can recore it if need be. Overall though, yeah, I feel this, especially on top of a very powerful chest or a very powerful brand on this chest, is a little bit too much. And that was also always the reason why I don't, when people went on those tirades of like, why did they put perfect talents on, you know, not this? The reason is balance. This unbalances everything else. This makes everything else kind of unusable. Then we have another piece, which, yeah, kind of actually doesn't make it much better of a story. We have the Salvo here, gone in a flash, and this has rate of fire as one of its stats. It does, of course, again, come with a red core, as all unit alloys do, but then this, one of its stats is, instead of, for instance, having crit damage here, we have a rate of fire 8% of it, which is also pretty high. This one, though, is, I feel, again, a little bit overtuned. This could stand to be 6% and still be fine and competitive with a lot of other things. And at 6% as well, it wouldn't exceed, for instance, things like the Fox's Prayer and such on a lot of builds. Because we have Detox as our second stat, this rate of fire is also always active. At least with Detox, it's sometimes not active. It's not a lot, but it is still, you know, uptime of 90-85% in most situations. This rate of fire is always active. It is 8%. It isn't effectively its full 8%, for instance, especially on Striker, where it is additive to the Gearset's 8%. But it is a lot again. I feel standing to lose 2 here to 6 rate of fire might make it a little bit more in line, as we'll see in the numbers in a second. And yeah, this combo especially is, of course, very strong, especially if we're going assault rifle damage. Now, of course, the Salvo by itself, if we're just not using, let's say, we aren't going with, or we're, for instance, going with a chest striker and then another exotic. Actually, that might be a better explanation here. Going this, and let's say Exodus, let's say, but Overdogs, actually. This piece by itself is, of course, a 50 or 13% rate of fire at the cost of basically a brand bonus and minor. So it is effectively 13% rate of fire against, let's say, 12 crit damage plus 13 from a Grupo piece or 8% crit chance. And that, of course, this is going to beat the ever-loving bejesus out of that, basically. And yeah, we'll see so in the numbers. Let's go actually look at this. And we have a lot of ground to cover here, as yeah, kind of went overboard with kind of comparing some of these already. Well, of course, in the future, I actually have a much more in-depth look into this once we have the final version, especially on this PTS version. I kind of course, wanted to go over it. We'll go kind of fast here because there's a lot to cover. And yeah, we're already going long, of course. These videos are pretty long, but let's not make them overly so. Here we're taking Strikers as our first comparison piece and kind of, yeah, looking at it with that unit and then perfect obliterate here. And then with Overdogs alongside of it. And especially looking at the comparison between unit alloys versus Cheska. And when we look at units here, especially with perfect obliterate on top, of course, it's going to definitely come ahead of Cheska because while the brand bonus is kind of around similar numbers, and we'll see that in the glass comparison here. Of course, that perfect obliterate on top being 4% more, that really does push it further. Here we're looking at it as well at 60 and 55. This was just to look at it at multiple values for the crit, because of course, once we remove Cheska actually out of the equation, it becomes a little bit harder to hit exactly 60. One of the things was the 10 from the watch, 8 from Cheska is 18. And of course, that is divisible by 6. 60 is divisible by 6. So especially if you, for instance, didn't take 5s on the weapon, if you just took 6s alongside of the 18 that you get from the watch plus Cheska, you would reach 60 eventually in a clean way. That isn't the case, of course, in really any way for when we take unit. We either land on 55 or 60. And yeah, it really depends on which weapon mods we take here. So for instance, for the 60 with the Cheska, we do need to take 3 crit damage mods, which isn't available for all weapons. But here for the Lexington that we're kind of using for the comparison is. We're of course gaining rate of fire here, and of course rate of fire here is already kind of diminished a little bit. One quick calculation here shows us that going from the 15 from just strikers to 20 increases our final output by 4.3% basically, instead of the 5 full percent. And that's of course any stats that we additively add to will have diminishing returns. And then we're seeing that here. The rate of fire, because Striker has rate of fire, then it's diminishing a little bit. But that, of course, still puts it quite high. And then, of course, perfect obliterate on top really makes a difference. That's also why we're looking at it with glass. If we took that Brandset, Cheska, and, of course, Sacrifice with perfect glass and kind of compare them on the glass, especially here, once we step away from having it be with the perfect obliterate on top, we can kind of see at just the brand level what the difference is. And of course, we're here looking just at the one-piece bonus of that rate of fire. Here we do have Killer available, and actually I'm going to turn off Killer first, because then what we see is that Cheska actually is bigger, which was actually a surprise to me, even on Striker, well, especially on Striker here, that it's still, because we are diminishing it a little bit, it is actually still ahead, that Cheska. But not by much. It is 2.47%. If we add in Killer, which of course adds into the crit of it, we actually see that the unit gains more respectively to the Cheska, because the Cheska already has more crit, so it actually is getting a little bit more diminishing returns when it comes to that Killer in comparison to the unit that is getting its true rate of fire already. And we see that as well once we activate Killer here. We see that instead of that 2%, it's now in the 1% range. And Cheska's still ahead of it though, but of course, yeah, as long as we're not going basically any, so this would only really matter because here as well we see that the Sacrifice, especially even at 20% headshot rate, so we're not even using that that extra headshot that we get from Providence, we're not using it at its full effect, just that 20% headshot rate. That Sacrifice still is always going to be the highest out of this. And that was always already the thing. And Sacrifice was already that kind of item where if we're going glass, most of the time, especially in a red build, we are going to go with the Sacrifice. And now it's going to be the same here for actually, especially that Equalizer. That Equalizer, yeah, is actually unequalizing and is much bigger, much bigger because of that perfect obliterate than any other obliterate could stand to be. Because already Cheska, of course, was the highest here. Grupo and Fenris would lose even further than this, so I didn't even include them here. But yeah, especially if we're going obliterate, that Equalizer is basically a de facto choice. That has its benefits, that has its downsides, but it is what it is. We'll see actually if they keep it as is, and yeah, the final version, I hope, well, I'm okay with this one. But especially as we move on forward, the combination of this with the Salvo, that kind of stands out. But first, let's move on actually, because there, of course, we were comparing it on the rate of fire and on a build where already there was some rate of fire. So let's move it on to here tipping scales. As here we basically have a similar looking multi-calculator kind of laid up as well, again with perfect obliterate and glass down here, although with a third stat. And this is just basically redoing it, but then with tipping scales, of course, because in Strikers we have some rate of fire there. We're diminishing basically the effectiveness of unit. And yeah, what does it look like on tipping scales instead? Here, though, we're taking just the Cheska at 60. We're putting it up against the perfect obliterate here first. And again, showing that that perfect obliterate especially really pushes far beyond the Cheska. And we see that, yeah, if we're going to run obliterate, the de facto pick is this new Equilizer, at least as it stands now with that 24% that it has. Then, secondly, of course, here, what I realized is that we're already also running still some rate of fire here because we're running it on the LMG's third stat. That's usually my go-to stat for tipping skills. If we take something else, but first, actually, let's discuss that. That 5% plus that 5% already diminishes the second 5% from unit effectively to 4.7% as we have it there. So already, even with a little bit, we're diminishing it a little bit as well. Less so than the striker, but still there. Does that mean that rate of fire actually becomes less of a choice as a third stat? Overall, I would say not particularly. Here though, with DTA and DTH, although at this 60% DTA rate that I quite often use, and this of course is, yeah, grounds for debate. you can definitely make an argument that maybe it's less, maybe it's more, or you want to use it in a specific way. Or for instance, one thing that I have is I generally take a DTH secondary LMG. And as long as I'm not running Tinkerer, of course, I'll use that secondary LMG with DTH. And then, for instance, if there is 2 Warhounds and a Chunga around, I'll just pull that one out and then use that LMG. And then go back to my rate of fire one for general use. The thing is, at general use, which I would say that 60% DTA kind of simplifies to being, you know, showing towards that as an average, rate of fire still pulls out ahead because it applies to everything and it's always active. That does mean, though, that on the sustain and on the damage per mag, it is actually now falling a little bit more behind because normally it is a little bit more ahead. As we kind of discussed, we are kind of effectively diminishing because it's not that just, you know, that rate of fire is perfectly fine and this other stat gets diminished. Both of the stats basically diminish each other's effectiveness. So here, by just dropping that rate of fire, we're pushing the unit back to 5% full effectiveness instead of the 4.7 that it is. What we see here again as well is that if we go with glass, kind of neutralizing that perfect obliterate out of the equation and just looking kind of at the brand bonuses, here though, Cheska is actually losing out quite heavily, especially at full stacks with tipping scales against that unit. And that is of course down to that crit damage that tipping scales has as its Gearset bonus. If we actually drop this back down to 0 stacks, so just when we're getting started basically with getting some damage out with tipping scales, we see that then it pushes back up to beyond the 2% difference in favor of our glass here on the Cheska. But that increases, of course, yeah, that gets lost the second we're pushing tipping scales to its 50 stacks, and yeah, then of course, yeah, it doesn't keep up anymore, and that's a given. We see here as well that actually because of headshot kind of getting diminished as well, this unit actually with just glass is actually exceeding the damage output here that we have on the perfect glass even. But that is at this 20% headshot rate, and it really depends on how much headshots you get, and yeah, especially if we do push this to 100% headshot rate, we see that even there, yeah, the sacrifice kind of pulls ahead. The thing is, though, that especially at the 20%, and yeah, if we push down back the tipping scales, we see that moving up to that 50%, that perfect glass is actually still a little bit ahead. There is, of course, also a difference on the other end of things with 10% more incoming damage, but that's not that impactful, actually. Going from 50% to 60%, you'll feel it a little bit. But here, though, I could definitely see, especially with tipping skills, that's kind of, yeah, diminishing the effectiveness of that sacrifice as well a little bit, to maybe go unit with glass. But overall, though, I think sacrifice is still going to be my pick there if I want to go glass. If we want to go obliterate, yeah, there is no better thing than the Equilizer there. But yeah, let's move on to the next one. And for that, we'll come here and start introducing Salvo into the mix. Mostly this is looking at if we went 2 pieces of high-end, what could we put there? And of course, now what we have as an option is that we can go here and have ourselves Salvo alongside of the Equilizer, especially if we're using an AR. Although actually really only if we're using AR that really makes sense. getting this 20% AR bonus on top of that rate of fire that already, as the one piece, was already ahead of Cheska. Here we're getting 20% assault rifle damage on top, and then also this rate of fire with the Salvo. And that's a lot. And yeah, that is actually, honestly, it's pushing us back to pre-nerf striker levels. So they, of course, brought the striker stacks down by 10, and they brought Obliterate down by 5. And basically, they're handing that back to us now, which kind of seems weird because, yeah, they did that for a little bit of a reason. Now, of course, this isn't a buff just to striker because, yeah, from a perspective, this is also pushing up other builds. You know, striker went down a little bit, but this is pushing up all builds a little bit. But really, the thing that will limit this, and we'll look at that later, is, yeah, we have exotics that are really powerful. And especially if we want to go Obliterate Chest, yeah, we would kind of lean towards that. But then, of course, there's Chest Striker, especially with the in-depth look later on into this gear set or brand set. We'll go with strikers, with the chest striker and stuff as well. Here we're kind of just keeping it to this. This video is already long enough as it is, but we'll definitely come back to it, of course, on the final version. Yeah, going back to our spreadsheet here, what we have here is equal or equalizer and then plus salvo. Here, equalizer plus just a unit, a piece of unit alongside of it, so we don't take the salvo, so we can kind of see what the salvo actually adds in. Because if we just had that second piece of unit alloys, we would have that 20% assault rifle damage. We would, of course, have 1 extra crit damage in this case. And then basically it's that crit damage versus that rate of fire. And I shouldn't really need to say that 12 crit damage is not going to really win against 8% rate of fire. Those two are not in line with each other. And we see that here. Basically, if we were to forego that rate of fire bonus, just take that second piece unit, we're basically losing a little bit over 2% versus that combo. And really, this combo only competes against exotics, and especially if you're not going against other ARs. But just for a general use striker, I could definitely see going this route, especially if you, for instance, already have coyotes in your team. You don't want to per se mess with any of the exotics kind of talents and such. Yeah, this is definitely the new go-to. So instead of, for instance, Cheska plus Grupo, which we'll see in a second as well, yeah, this is now the pick. If we go, for instance, instead of actually the chest piece, going with perfect obliterate, just with a unit piece there, we can kind of see as well that the increase from the obliterates 4% is actually more than the salvo, as we see here, as we're dropping more damage. And that's just to illustrate, yeah, that 4% of the perfect obliterate is also really impactful, of course. It's here especially the combination of the two that really pushes, for instance, going with Cheska Grupo, which definitely was one of the picks that a lot of people would go with, just foregoing an exotic, and especially in the past, of course, the go-to was, if there was enough coyotes in the team, you would run the Cheska chest with obliterate, and then you would put a Grupo piece in, or a Fenris piece in. And yeah, we're pushing basically a little bit over 7%, just a little bit over 7% more damage out just by equipping these two pieces. And that's, of course, within the range of kind of the coyote, which we'll also see in a second. If we go Cheska plus the equalizer, so instead of the salvo, we take the Cheska. That doesn't actually beat the salvo variant, of course, at all. Because, yeah, the Cheska, the brand bonus, that 20 AR damage by itself is also very large. And then the Cheska plus salvo also actually doesn't catch up to anything. So effectively, this means that especially that equalizer plus salvo combo is really potent. And in comparison to a Cheska plus Grupo combo, we're basically pushing we're dropping 7% damage towards it. And yeah, in the other version, in the other way, that's actually a bigger number in percentages even. What we can look at as well is going, for instance, equalizer plus coyote here. And especially looking at that versus just taking unit with normal obliterate just for comparison's sake to the Cheska. And then getting Cheska plus coyote. And here all the coyotes at 15 to 25 range. We see, of course, no surprise there, actually, the equalizer plus the coyote, because we're still comparing against everything to top. with the Coyote in the right ranges, and this is kind of the important one here as well, with the Coyote in the right ranges, the Coyote is just a little bit ahead. And this is actually before we activate Killer here, which Killer would of course be a much bigger component on the Salvo pieces. So for instance here, actually when we trigger Killer, we see that it falls way behind now, because in comparison, the pieces that had that rate of fire, they're not adding into the already diminishing pool of crit damage, which Crit Killer comes in and diminishes even more. So they gain more from Killer overall. And we see that here. So actually with Killer active, Equalizer plus Coyote at the right range is behind just taking the Salvo there. So now the Coyote basically just becomes really, if you're not using ARs, or if, still in a group setting, of course, the group buff section of it, it might be worth it to drop that little bit of damage to give the rest of the team that buff. But yeah, especially in comparison to the Cheska plus Coyote that we had in the past and in the right range, this Salvo plus Equalizer combo is actually, again, way further ahead. And yeah, this is kind of a little bit of an issue, because as we see here as well, that was already a little bit ahead of going Cheska plus Grupo, was this percentage ahead of it, and then, yeah, we're now pushing up way higher, even without the Coyote. This is maybe a little bit too much power creep, I feel, and both the combination of having the Equalizer coming in and the Salvo together, plus these brand bonuses, might be a little bit too much a kick in the, what I feel, in the power creep direction. One thing I would think is that maybe going, for instance, as we discussed with the Salvo, pushing that to 6%, maybe considering instead of the Equalizer adding to the damage, adding to the time component of Obliterate, might help mitigate this a little bit. One thing I wanted to look at as well, and let's go do that here, is looking versus Salvo versus some of the other named items, as we'll come into this one. And as we see here, actually, yeah, so we have on an AR build first, and then secondary on an LMG setup, going with first Equalizer plus Salvo, then Equalizer plus Fox, Equalizer plus Contractors, Equalizer plus Hollow Man, and then Equalizer plus Cheska, just kind of as a control there. And doing the same then for M249, but here first with the Lexington, because of course with the Lexington, we're also taking with the Salvo, we're taking that second piece, of course, we're getting the 20% AR from it. And then we see actually that, yeah, none of the other named pieces that we quite often consider. Now, of course, normally, especially with the 60% here on the DTA rate, nothing already kind of usually kept up with the Cheska, because yeah, the other pieces were always generally, especially if we're kind of looking at them in this way, kind of a little bit behind. If we activate Killer in here, and yeah, let's actually have Killer active, we see that, yeah, then especially Fox can kind of come a little bit closer, but doesn't fully catch up to Cheska. And that's always why we went, you know, Cheska basically first into these, because yeah, they generally, even for instance, for Chest Striker, Coyote plus Cheska generally outperformed Coyote plus Fox's Prayer. Here now with the Equalizer, we see that, yeah, the Cheska is still kind of, if we're going for a second piece alongside of it, the Salvo, of course, wins by a long shot, especially on AR, but then the second piece is still the Cheska. And this, to me, feels a little bit out of whack. These items, the other ones, are close to each other. So the Fox's Prayer is definitely a little bit ahead of Contractors and Hollow Man, but Hollow Man and Contractors were kind of close to each other. And then even from the Fox to the Cheska, it wasn't that big of a jump. This is a humongous jump, right? I feel I'm beating a little bit of a dead horse here, but yeah, I do feel strongly about that. That Salvo especially, maybe a little bit much. Looking at it for LMGs, here of course we're wasting on the Salvo, we're wasting that 20% AR now. But even if we're wasting that, and here on the second one we're comparing again, we're not comparing at the top here, where we're comparing all of the black numbers basically to this top one. We see that now just by a little bit the Fox beats it, and this is with us wasting that second brand bonus there. Contractors, of course, with an LMG beating it out, Cheska kind of keeping up. But the Salvo is actually so strong that, yeah, it is actually, you know, it is in the range of that Fox's prayer. But then, of course, it's also, we're actually, that first bonus was kind of still wasting that second bonus there. And that 20% on top, of course, on ARs is what is causing this. Because actually, if that second bonus or a first bonus that wasn't damage related was there with that 20% AR, then it would be fine, because we see that here in this. But especially adding 20% rate of AR on top of that 5% rate of fire, which is already a good brand bonus, that pushes it really high. Because here we see that actually this, when that 20% AR damage isn't there, of course the contractors kind of beats out everybody else, because we do gain that 10% extra there. And that does make quite a bit of difference. And I feel this is kind of to highlight that the Salvo might be a little overtuned. And then quickly as well, of course, we want to know, especially taking that Equalizer plus Salvo combo against some of the exotics, of course, because that's the other thing that we could put alongside of the Equalizer, especially if we can obliterate. Again, here, I'm kind of leaving out Chest Striker for a little bit. We'll look at it with the final version with an in-depth look when it's out, because we're also, of course, going already way too long here, just to not scope creep too much. So if we take Equalizer plus Overdogs, Overdogs is, of course, way bigger, especially when it is active. The thing with it is, of course, it is not always active. That's why we're looking at it here, both with it inactive and then active. So inactive, it drops 10% behind. Active, it drops or comes up 17, almost 18% ahead. So the over-under is pretty hefty, of course. Overdogs a pretty big buff. Overall, though, I feel if you're just running Overdogs and kind of on average, kind of half of the time are shooting the right enemy, that of course puts it kind of in the smack in the middle of this, where you're still ahead versus the Salvo. The thing is, though, that the Salvo is just always on, of course. The thing to also remember, though, is that actually one of the downsides of just pushing into rate of fire side of things is that your sustain doesn't per se go up, nor does your damage per mag. Anything adding to the damage side of the calculations, because rate of fire, of course, is basically on the RPM side of the DPS calculations. We have the damage, we have the RPM or RPS, effectively, where we're dividing by 60 to get the rounds per second from that rounds per minute. That's times the damage, so how much damage are we doing, how many times we're doing it in a second. Here with the RPM, or with the rate of fire, we're adding to the side of the how often we're doing that damage. That doesn't actually change how much, that does change our DPS, but that doesn't change, for instance, how much damage is in a mag. And because of that, actually, for instance, the Overdogs, when it is active, it is way further ahead on the damage per mag. It is way further ahead on the sustain end of things as well. Because, of course, as our rate of fire goes up, we're just firing faster and our reload hits more often. So we're reloading more often, and because of that, our sustain drops quite a bit. Or well, doesn't raise as much as if we put it into the damage end. That's actually the right way to say it. And we see that here. The Overdogs is 20% ahead on the sustain end of things as well. A little bit more than on the burst end. And of course, on the mag damage end, yeah, it's way ahead when it is active. The downside, of course, is it's not always active. We have some control over that, but not all the control that we would want. But Overdogs has quickly become kind of the meta, I feel. It is, even if you're not focusing on getting actually it on target all the time, most of the time, more times than not, especially because how the tiering is set up, a lot of the enemies like Grenadiers, like Rushers, like Assaults, like Snipers that are in that lowest tier will always be bonused against them. Because of that, yeah, it actually becomes generally a bigger bonus than most of the other things. Because as we saw already, yeah, the Coyote actually not ahead here as well, including the Coyote in the wrong range. So if we are setting it up for that 15 to 25, what if we're in the 0 to 15? We're actually quite a bit ahead, behind the Salvo. And even with the Coyote in the right range, if we're, for instance, solo, the Salvo actually wins that, at least in its current incarnation. And the thing is, though, that, yeah, the Coyote, it is a group buff, so we can provide it to 3 team members. In Countdown, we're providing to 7 team members. That actually, of course, has some value. So you could stand to, to lose that a little bit of damage, especially in comparison to the Overdogs and such. It's a much bigger gap, of course. But then giving that group buff out. And as a whole, as a group, you're doing more damage then. And especially with the Coyote, that does hold true. Then also, actually, of course, one of the things we kind of have to look at is what if we take it with a Ninjabag? Because actually, the Ninjabag is, of course, always kind of there. One of the bigger downsides for the Ninjabag is especially that Strikers is kind of the general meta in a lot of things, and it really likes its backpack. Here, if we take Striker with the Ninjabag, we of course take 3 pieces alongside of it, and then yeah, the Equalizer and the Salvo. As we saw, the Equalizer and the Salvo are pretty potent. But how does this land? Because especially here, we're getting this 50% magazine size if we're taking it this way. Now, 50% magazine size is at least still towards DPS, sustained DPS in this case, because it doesn't add to the burst DPS, but we're doing our burst DPS for a longer time at the very least as well. We are getting 75 mag out of that from Lexington, and of course, yeah, with an Elmo that even pushes further. Is this actually a viable thing to do? Now, still not really in the grand scheme of things, because if we go to the numbers here, what we see is actually if we take, for instance, just the Equalizer plus Salvo, and we just take the full red variant that we had with the 4-piece or without the Ninjabag in there, basically the full Striker variant that we had. Yeah, neither of these on the burst really keep up. But of course, because we're getting that magazine size, our damage per mag is actually keeping up somewhat, especially well, pushing even further ahead. It is actually competitive with when the Overdogs is active on the damage per mag, but of course, again, the burst very much isn't. The burst is even lower, even at full stacks, because of course, yeah, we are here at full stacks, but of course, because we don't have the Striker backpack nor a damage down to kind of make up for it, yeah, it is kind of falling behind, even behind the Overdogs just by itself, just without it being active actually. So when it becomes active, it pushes way further ahead. On the sustain end of things, because of that magazine size, of course, it actually does catch up a little bit. There's another version we could go for, and that is actually taking the Equalizer as a chest, because actually taking a 2-piece to get the 3-piece bonus is actually not as valuable as taking 2 separate brands, so we get 4 bonus, because basically with this, of course, if we're taking the Equalizer and the Salvo, what we get is just 2 bonuses becoming 3. If we take instead Fenris, what we get is the rate of fire, the 20% AR damage, 10% AR damage from Fenris, and then 30% reload. So we basically get 10% AR damage, 30% reload instead of that 50% magazine. And we see that that is actually a little bit of a better way to go. Our damage from mag, of course, doesn't actually go up by that much because, of course, yeah, 50% mag damage is, or 50% damage, or 50% magazine size adds quite a bit to your damage from mag. But also, it doesn't add 50% over R because, of course, yeah, our burst is somewhat lower, so our damage per shot is actually lower because of that. Even though we're getting 50% more rounds, we're actually only getting 25% more damage into that mag. Here, though, our damage per mag doesn't go up, of course, because we don't have a magazine size, but our reload, because of that reload, our sustain is somewhat keeping up. And of course, on the sustain end, all of these kind of do keep up, especially because of the Salvo kind of being a little bit worse on the sustain end. Of course, against that Overdogs, yeah, no, especially when it is active. But here, especially, those bursts really hurt this. And that's why I generally wouldn't go for this. What you do get for this, of course, is a blue and a yellow core. The thing is, though, that we can actually, what I can do is just take this number, 100, take 2 cores off, and we just put it to 70. Now, we can take a blue and a yellow on just 4-piece Striker, Equalizer plus Salvo, a blue and a yellow on those pieces without the Ninjabag, basically getting that blue and yellow, and we're still 5% ahead on the burst. We're, of course, not ahead on the sustain, so you could make that case because, of course, this eats into this. Well, this doesn't add as much to the sustain because of that rate of fire bonuses. But especially there as well is, yeah, that we can kind of reach much better burst. And yeah, even on the damage per mag here, of course, we're kind of keeping up with that, except for when we get the plus 50. But the burst is still behind here by a significant margin. But of course, again, what we can do is also just be full red and actually just take that damage and use that damage as our way of surviving. And that's kind of the way I lean quite often. There's definitely things to be said here for that blue and yellow core that we get. Here, at least with ARs, we do get to use it. We can get a shield going with it, maybe even a skill alongside of it, although most of the time you will just take a Revive Hive. But yeah, that Ninjabag is, as always, quite a hard sell. Yeah, let's move on to the next one, as we'll move on to the gear set, as of course, with all seasons, we get a new gear set alongside of it. This time it is Concentrated Company, and this is actually a pretty interesting gear set by itself. It is very much kind of in line with the season, with, for instance, having that companion. But what it has as its two-piece is 10% weapon damage, limited, but of course universal, so we can go with any weapon type. At the three-piece, 30% weapon handling, which is of course a little bit more than, for instance, we get with, let's say, Heartbreaker or, for instance, Striker. It is a little bit less, and of course, tipping skills at full stacks, but this by itself, always active weapon handling, is pretty nice. In the four pieces, we get the talent of it, and this is this camaraderie. Shooting an enemy marks them for 7 seconds. It is of note that this is actually not a refreshing type of mark, so every time we hit the enemy, we don't reapply the mark, the way that we do, for instance, with OD, where every time we're shooting the enemy, we're just resetting it to full duration. Here, once we mark the enemy, it'll just start to feed away, and then it'll fall away, even if we're continuously shooting at that enemy. Which can be quite annoying, because, yeah, you can't kind of... Sometimes it does fall away while you're reloading and your allies kill an enemy. Because, of course, what we need is when a marked enemy dies, receive 1 stack of 3% weapon damage for each ally or skill that has contributed to killing that enemy. So we apply the mark. Any ally or skill that helps in killing that gives us a stack. There is a maximum amount of marks that can be placed, which is 3. And also our max stacks is 35. And stacks decay every 10 seconds. Now, this was actually a little bit confusing at the start when just reading the patch notes, where I was like, does this mean everything decays in 10 seconds like the backfire? No, it is. And I should actually change the wording on this. This is 1 stack decays every 10 seconds. So this means that this is a very long duration buff. At its max, we're 350 seconds, just a little bit shy of 6 minutes. So 5 minutes, 50 seconds is actually, once we're at full stacks, that's how long it'll take to deteriorate all the way down to 0. Which is, of course, a far cry from, for instance, the 75 that we have with a 100 stack Striker. Or, for instance, the much faster 8 seconds that Tipping Skills loses its stacks at. So the way that this is more set up is that we can have it be that we have a lot of stacks building up. It isn't, of course, going into that high a level of stacks, but they decay very slowly. So it's a slow buildup, but a long retention. The direct opposite of Tipping Skills, where it is a decently fast buildup, also unneeded that we hit an enemy or kill an enemy, but then it decays super fast. So this is kind of the polar opposite of those. And then, of course, yeah, we gain 3% weapon damage per stack for here. This means that without the backpack, which we do have here, this would be 105 weapon damage, and this is just weapon damage. This is that same all weapon damage as red cores, as grading, as, you know, specific weapon damage going into that same pool as well. So it is a stat that we're diminishing heavily. This is not a separate multiplier, a separate amp or such. And actually, what we'll be using a lot with it as well is the backpack. This increases the weapon damage bonus per stack from 3% to 5%. This makes a lot of sense, especially to bring in some of the exotics, as we have here with the Overdogs. But of course, as well, taking it from 3% to 5% means we're taking it to 175, 70 stacks more, 2 times the 35, 70 stacks or 70 weapon damage more in total. And that will be competitive. Even still with vigilance and such. We're not going to look at that actually in the numbers today, but especially when we go to the in-depth look with it, of course we will. Here, though, I'm not taking the chest. The chest comes with the talent of All for One, and this increases the amount of marks that can be placed from 3 to 5. So this just increases the amount of enemies that we can mark. And I feel, for a large part, that 3 is more than enough, because your allies are not going to kill too many. And then, of course, this would come at the cost of a weapon talent or a chest talent. And yeah, that's too big of an ask for just increasing the amount of enemies that can be marked. Especially because they decay fast, and honestly, if you're doing 3, you're likely moving between them and kind of going back. Although what you find yourself doing most often in group settings especially, is kind of shooting for the same target that you see other people shooting at or where your skills go. And this then has, of course, kind of become so that it's actually kind of reliant on teammates. So for instance, if I just have one skill, or well, if I want to keep my revive hive, as we for instance have here, I just have a turret or a drone, and that will do some damage. One thing we can take as well, actually, is Oxy and such. I found works pretty well, especially on spawning waves, because it's continuously doing damage. I can mark them in time and kind of burn them down. We're not per se using it for their damage, we're just using it to get those extra stacks out of it. At the start of this, I was very hesitant, and I was kind of playing around with it in the range solo with a turret and a drone. Here as well, in the range, actually, the companion system doesn't activate in any safe space or shared space. That system is shut off, so at the range we can't have our buddy running around and yelling in our ear. But we can use a turret and drone. I was trying to just kind of build up stacks, and it felt very slow. I really wanted to try it in a team, and actually I did so quite recently. And in a team, it actually feels substantially better. Because yeah, there we suddenly have allies to kind of work together with. They might have their own skills going. One of the things is also in a group setting, it actually shows the mark on the enemy. And that means that with good allies that are kind of, paying attention, they might, in the same way as with OD, or for instance, helping an Eclipse kind of, spread their fire. With good teammates, they'll go for those targets kind of because they're marked, they'll just shoot them on top just to help out actually. And in a group setting, just for instance, doing some retaliation, just doing a few of the mobs outside of a control point and then pushing into the control point at the start filled me up all the way to the full stacks. And that was actually very surprising to me, going from that solo experience kind of to that group experience and how much of a difference it made. And from that, actually, it really changed my opinion on this, because before that, looking at the numbers as I had, I was really dreading kind of how it would work out. But honestly, after, I feel it's actually in a really good place. I still think it could use a little bit of a pinch more damage, and I'll actually advocate for that in a second in the numbers. And then just to show how it kind of works, you're just at the range, not per se in combat. We can mark up to 3 enemies. Once 3 enemies are marked, we can't mark a 4th. We could take the chest, of course, to increase that amount, but yeah, that's not really, that part would not matter, I would think. But then also, yeah, whenever an enemy dies or it times out, we can apply new marks, of course. One of the downsides is, as you can see here, as I keep shooting the enemy, it doesn't reapply the mark, or it doesn't jump back to full the way that, for instance, does for OD. And a few times this has kind of hurt me, where like towards the end and they're about to die and I catch myself in a reload, and then like an ally kills them and they weren't marked at the time of death, so we don't get it. But of course as well, once we start killing, as we see there, I have the buff on my buff bar and then a bar underneath it showing how many stacks I have. So here I do count as an ally. I am an ally to myself, apparently, and we count for 1 stack by ourselves. Now if I take my drone out and put that on this enemy, and as it starts shooting it, I start shooting it, means that I get 2 stacks per kill. Now, of course, with some teammates, and especially, for instance, the companion of this season, that counts as well. If I'm shooting the same target as them, basically, we are getting 3 stacks. But especially if I have some teammates in the group with their skills on top, or maybe, some, and then, of course, as well, a companion with the modifier on, or even, for instance, yeah, pushing it to 7 players alongside of me in a countdown, this stacks up actually decently fast. This set, especially in a group setting and kind of on a player that is, if you play it a little bit smart and kind of go for the targets that you see other people go for, works out really well, actually. And And of course, you can mark those enemies because also I don't need to be the person to get the kill. It is in the same way as OD. Once the enemy is marked, as long as they die in whatever way, that will work out. So actually, when a wave spawns, just kind of spamming and making sure that 3 marks are out there will make it so that there's a high likelihood, especially in a 4-man team, that, you know, they get sprayed down quickly, but also multiple people hitting each of them. And that adds up, of course. Together with that, we can also damage with other skills, as we talked about, for instance, going with Oxy or Sedge. Overall, though, I found that actually, in a group setting, this completely changed in perspective. Because here, solo, as we saw here, it's not feeding up real quick. Unless I'm really getting kills quickly, plus a drone there, of course, and such. It doesn't fill up as fast. But especially out in the world, with a companion alongside, with 3 teammates alongside of me, it actually filled up really quickly. And that makes it so that actually I think it is close to being where it needs to be. But I do feel still, though, that actually, especially with the backpack on, this could stand to have a little bit extra. Let's go to the numbers while I'll make a case for that. And for that, we'll come to this multi-calculator here, as we'll be looking at the gear set, and then especially as well, looking at how many stacks we have going, as that is, of course, this being a stacking build in effect really does matter to it. We'll be comparing it as well against a striker with Obliterate. And actually, unlike the build that I had on a second ago, with all of these, we're just running it with the Equilizer, unit alloys, perfect Obliterate, and the overdogs as the piece. Here we see then actually at 0 stacks versus 35 stacks, we are gaining about, on the build itself, that 175 weapon damage, as we have that here. Because it is a full red build, and also, of course, for instance, we even have 10 weapon damage there on top, with high grading, as we're kind of looking at it at grade 30, that 175 weapon damage is turning into 64% extra damage. Now, this should already be the giveaway that, yeah, it is not going to beat Strikers, for instance, because Strikers by itself is a separate multiplier. With the Obliterate chest, it would be a 90% separate multiplier. That means that that one would be basically 90% here. The thing is, though, does it need to? I think it needs to be closer than it is here, where on 0 stacks all the way to 35, we are gaining slowly, and especially if we kind of look here and we start already comparing it to Strikers with Obliterate, with the perfect Obliterate and the same overdogs, basically the same layout, except we're swapping between Strikers in this. At 0 stacks, that Striker is already a little bit ahead because it has that rate of fire bonus, which is worth much more than that weapon damage bonus, of course. And at full stacks, it is way ahead still of max stacked here with the CC, with the concentrated company. I totally remembered the name there. Here we see basically against the concentrated company at 35 stacks, an Obliterate Striker at max stacks is around 126% increase over it. Thing is, though, of course, Striker stacks differently, but that's actually still in the favor of Striker, because stacking to 100 with Striker is not that hard. Just doing it with an ACS can get you there, but even just shooting with the AR, you'll get there eventually, and especially in the harder fights. In the fights where it matters, Strikers will be easier to kind of stack up to the levels needed. Here we need kills, of course, to get our concentrated company going. And while we don't need 35 kills, we need, because this is, of course, you can get multiple marks, or you can get multiple stacks off of 1 mark. It depends on how many allies and you are shooting at that marked target. And yeah, you can get up to a ton of stacks pretty quickly. So you can reach 35 stacks. It'll take a little bit longer than Striker, definitely, but you, of course, lose it much slower. We have basically 5 minutes, 50 seconds before we decay all the way from full to empty. Because of that, there is actually a really profound gameplay advantage to this concentrated company, because it starts at a higher level once it has those stacks. But especially when it doesn't have those stacks, Striker fills up pretty quickly to the 30, 40 stacks. You know, 1 mag out, you can land 30 shots out of that. You know, that's a 60% accuracy rate. you'll get those 60 stacks out of it. Of course, they'll start decaying as well right away, but you know, here getting those early stacks feels really painful because you're exceptionally weak, and yeah, you're basically on the level of an even below an unstacked striker, and you'll be there for a little bit until you get your first kill at the very least. Striker, even before it gets a kill, can already build up some stacks. Because of that, that's also why, yeah, Striker becomes the general meta that it is. It is very usable. It is just simple. It doesn't need kills. It doesn't need other things. It's just, if it's shooting something, it's going to increase its damage. And if you need increased damage, you're likely shooting something anyway. And one of the things I'm going to advocate for here is, well, first of all, actually, before we do that, let's actually look at it if we have no red cores, because that, of course, it is weapon damage. Because of that, if we have 0 red cores, then what we have is that potency of the stacks is much more there. And we say that here as well, because now instead of that 60-ish% that we had, now we're in the 97% out of that 175 weapon damage. So we're getting 97% out of that in actual increase. And of course here, at 0 stacks, it's kind of getting closer to Striker, but it's still not catching up to Striker even at that Obliterate. And of course, keep in mind that this is Obliterate Striker, this isn't Chest Striker. Chest Striker is another 20%-ish above this. A little bit less now because, yeah, that Perfect Obliterate eats into it a little bit, but it is still closer to 20% over it than not. That makes it to me that, because at this 0, because I would say definitely at full blue, there should be maybe a reason to kind of have this be a good build to go full blue with. That would open it up as well for instance, making tech tanks out of and other builds. But here, especially because also we want the backpack, we'll look with the in-depth look. Here, actually, I'm just going to exclude actually looking without the backpack, but we'll definitely look at that in the in-depth look once we have the final version. Let's push this back up. Although actually, before we do, let's push this actually, instead of 5 weapon damage per stack with the backpack, what if we push this to 6 weapon damage per? Now what we see is actually at full blue or full yellow, and actually there is a case to be made here, especially going full yellow, going 6-tier yellow, or well, 5 plus technician, for instance, to hybridize it, to maybe take a turret and drone alongside of it, because if we're using those anyway to get marks and such, we might as well make them a little bit potent. If we make that 6, now we see that here at least it kind of surpasses Obliterate Striker. It still wouldn't surpass Chest Striker, so this would have some viability there, but especially, of course, if we kind of look at it at 6 red cores, now it is still not ahead of Striker, but it is getting closer, and it jumped up by a little bit over 10%, and that is, I think, a healthier place for it. And I would maybe advocate for it being there to maybe be a 3 and a 6%. That would make the gap with the backpack a little too big and make the backpack kind of must-have, but then also actually pushing it to 4 and 6, that breaks in a few other places. So I would maybe say, or maybe 3.5 and 6 might be an option, but 3.5 is an awkward number and you might want to avoid it. But I would definitely say pushing this to 6 might be an idea here. Especially as well, as we'll look into a second, where it actually applies, of course, it being weapon damage, has some traits where other stats don't kind of mingle into there. Especially, for instance, Pestilence, as we'll look into in a second. And that pushes that one up a little bit beyond, actually, the high end, but it needs to stack to get there, the high-end Lengmo that we're kind of running in general. Here, though, going back to that 5% to kind of look at it one final time as it is now, especially here, even as we have an option here to add some stacks in. I believe it was on either 70 or 80, I forget a little bit. It is at 65, I believe, maybe. No, 60? Or was it 60 actually? Or maybe that was with the 6 actually. Let's go take it down to 50 stacks. So 55 stacks is already, yeah, at 55 stacks, as we have it there with Striker. we already actually surpass at 65 stacks this new Gearset, this concentrated company. I feel that's a little bit early in the scheme of things. And that's why I would definitely think that, yeah, pushing it up to 6, and I think actually that was the reason I was thinking of 70, is that if we push it up to 6, we basically need to be just a little bit below 70 with here 68, I believe, maybe. At 68 to 69, which is a nice number, I feel. Then Strikers kind of overtakes it. And that match point is always very important. That's actually one of the things that I kind of use. Now, of course, we're kind of using Strikers in that measure, but yeah, it is a important place, because if it is too low in the stacks, yeah, we're going to lean towards Striker, because we're going to get those stacks pretty easily. I do feel, though, pushing this to 6, because also, yeah, there is a big difference, or actually two big differences. One is also in the weapon handling, where that sets 30 against the 15 of Striker, and you definitely feel that. But of course, it decays much slower, because here as well, it isn't stronger than Obliterate Striker, but it is a little bit closer. Let's take this back to the 5, and actually let's go look at it with the Pestilence. And as with all of these gear sets, if they can provide some weapon damage and such, some weapons really do lean towards that, one of them being the Pestilence. Of course, the Pesti tick is dependent on weapon damage and total weapon damage, and DTA, DTH, and damage to targets out of cover. Here we are getting weapon damage, and alongside of Virtuoso being one of the other gear sets where we can get a decent amount of weapon damage, although with Virtuoso we were just getting 80, and that was why it wasn't per se competitive against some other things, like here for instance going against the high end. So here with the high end we're thinking about the Lengmo setup, where we're taking Sacrifice, Overdogs, Fox's Prayer, 3 pieces Lengmo, one of them being the backbone, which is the go-to now for the Pestilence, because especially with the Overdogs up and active, which does apply to the Pesti tick, we're getting a really high tick, and this is a tick that we hadn't seen before, basically. With this concentrated, what we're getting is on the DPS end, as we can compare them, because we're kind of looking at it in multiple ways. Of course, we have the DPS of the build, we have the tick, and then we can combine one tick and the DPS of the build kind of as a, if we had a full stack and we're doing our full DPS at full stacks, what is that together? And of course, with the high end, we don't need to per se stack, except for the backbone. We need 5 kills for that. Once the backbone is stacked to full, then we're doing that DPS. Here with this other gear set, we need to charge up for quite some time, but then it doesn't decay. It doesn't actually decay even as fast as, for instance, because we'll lose all of our backbone stacks, all of our perfectly unstoppable 4 stacks, basically in the same time that we lose 1 stack of this concentrated. And that is actually impactful. The thing is, though, that, yeah, it takes way longer to get there, but once we're there, we can kind of keep it. What I've been finding myself doing as well, actually, in actual gameplay is that if I'm running around, I'll play with the other weapon, basically here, a Lexington with Killer. I'll run with that till I have a bunch of stacks, then I'll swap over to the Pestilence. Because, yeah, the Pestilence will feel weak until we have a decent amount of stacks going. But once we do, that tick actually is the new high. And, yeah, it is actually, although now as well, we could, for instance, if we, for instance, went with some other things that could be a little bit higher, we could get it a little bit higher, but then of course what we want is always the balance between the build's DPS and the tick, because again, the tick here, even at 2 million, the build is doing 11 million. And here at 20% headshot rate and 60% armor rate, although actually neither of the builds has any DTA, so actually that part doesn't matter, but at 20% headshot rate. This, of course, is, yeah, kind of 5.5 times as much, and because of that, the build's DPS really also matters. So we want to kind of find a balancing point between the two, where we're not giving up too much of the one or too much of the other. And I feel this build, this gear set really does align well with this. The thing is, though, that, yeah, the high-end Pesti one here, because both of these are glass, so that's not a difference. The high-end one does have perfectly unstoppable, so it doesn't need to stack 5 kills, but so does this other gear set, basically. At the very least, even with full teammates and such, it will take at least 5 kills. But yeah, it does decay a lot slower. But the combined of them is actually a little bit in the favor of the high end, the tick is definitely in the favor of combined, and the build's DPS is very much in favor of the high end again. And sustain wise, the reload really helps out, and that's actually one of the major ones here as well. We are getting 50 or 30% weapon handling, but it's translating into 30% reload. And it took me a while actually to figure out why I liked the Pestilence so much on this and why it felt so good. And yeah, the big factor there is that extra reload that we have there. And of course, the handling feeding into accuracy and stability. Feels even better than OD, where OD has just the 30% reload, where, for instance, with the triple tick, the Pesti feels a little bit better than most cases. But here it's also, yeah, weapon handling, so it's actually even better for that. And I feel this is actually a good case for this build, or for this gear set, to make this a Pesti build. But then also, actually, again, as we were kind of advocating, what if we push this 5 per stack with the backpack to a 6 per stack? And actually, I feel here as well, again, we kind of see a good case for maybe considering that as if they would take it to 6%, we see that it pushes a little further ahead from the high end. But then again, this high end actually just fills up a lot easier, quicker, effectively, because of that ensemble force, but then it also decays much faster than it. But I feel this is a pretty balanced setup because, of course, this is at full ticks. It takes a while to get there, and that does, even a group setting, and when it was going fast, it still takes way longer than Striker, for instance. But yeah, this I feel actually here, because one of the concerns that I had of like pushing weapon damage too high would be just to, yeah, the Pestilence would become an OP thing. Same would be actually true for some of the other things that scale off of weapon damage, like the Ravenous, like the Merciless and stuff. But yeah, this is very much, I think, still within balance. And I think here, yeah, pushing it to 6, I really think it's a good idea. Let's put it back to 5 here, though, as yeah, that is for both of these. Especially one of the things, though, is that, especially if we kind of look at it with the CC stacks, is that if we push the CC stacks down, and especially at 0 stacks, of course, that Pesti on the start of it, although, of course, yeah, it wouldn't have its perfect ensemble force, but if it was even dropping 35%, effectively here, it's still way ahead, of course. So it is very much reliant on those stacks, and but that's also kind of fine. We can use a different weapon and just stack those there. Once we have the stacks, then we go for the Pestilence. And the stacks do retain for long enough that you can very easily go from activity to activity, control point to control point, and still keep it up. I do feel, though, it would be nice, yeah, if it was a little bit more ahead, especially at full stacks, that would kind of encourage some usage of that. Lastly, I wanted to kind of see where it lands against some of the other gear sets, as there are, of course, other gear sets than just Striker, and it's kind of handy to compare to some of them, especially as well, just going against high ends as well. So here we have that same CC at 35 stacks with the Lexington with Killer. We're adding in weapon talents here because, of course, when we're comparing against OD, we kind of need to have Sadist there as part of the equation because, of course, Ongoing Directive gets to have Sadist, and because of that, kind of is a little bit ahead, more so than the build itself would kind of make it appear. But that's also, yeah, where we're including Killer, and it's basically always active as into this calculation, which also, again, Killer, of course, does need a kill to get it going and such. But also against Umbra here, Umbra Initiative at the full 50 stacks with a Vigilance backpack there. And yeah, that can actually, of course, be a real good performer as well. And that's actually usually a little bit behind where Strikers is. Umbra is kind of on the heels of Strikers and Heartbreakers. And Tipping Skills is kind of behind those two, and then it's Umbra. So here especially as well, and then concluding with an high-end Obliterate Vigilance with the new Obliterate, of course, adding a little bit of rate of fire in there and performing much better than it used to in the past. But especially that high-end and that OD, we can kind of see as the floor. Any builds that are below that, and that's also kind of the issue for instance, Aces and such, and Breaking Point, I feel, in my opinion, and such, that are damage-wise below those, and OD and high ends can already be pretty consistent. Now, of course, as we saw, these are kind of, because here they're kind of lining up against this concentrated. But of course, the concentrated was way behind Strikers, and that's also kind of what we see. And then the Umbra is a little bit ahead. But here we do see that by itself, at that 35 stacks, it is, of course, a little bit ahead of ongoing directive. But of course, ongoing directive is much easier to get going to that point, because all we need is just to get the ammo going, basically, and then it's ongoing. And the downside is, though, we still, if we run into something mechanical or such, a warhand, yeah, they don't bleed, so we lose a little bit of our buff. But in general, a build kind of at least needs to be above ongoing directive and above the high ends to kind of be effective enough, because otherwise, why bother, right? If, especially with a high end as a comparison here, if I can just have it be that I'm just running this high end, I just need to stack Obliterate in this case. It's running Vigilance. It can drop Vigilance, of course, which would lose it a little bit of damage. But this Concentrated needs a lot more time to get to this point. Now, of course, it retains it much more, even much more so than Obliterate. But Vigilance, of course, yeah, we can, for instance, hide behind a shield to keep that uptime a little bit there. This is, again, also why I would say that, while I think in this, it's reasonably playable, basically. It's definitely not completely out of the pack. But I would say just being a little bit ahead of an ongoing directive and just a little bit ahead of an high end would put it still in a place where it's just, it won't see much use after its, first incarnations where, it's the new thing to try out. But again, if we maybe consider putting it to 6 with the backpack, 6 weapon damage, what we see is that it catches up and is closer to the Umbra. And I feel actually that is a healthy place for a lot of the red builds, especially red style builds, to be. Now, of course, this would mean, though, still again, if, for instance, if we are going to hybridize it, this is way better for that. But that's then also kind of okay, because if we're making a turret-drone hybrid, yeah, this gear set would, this concentrated gear set would work much better than ongoing or Umbra, for instance, here. But that, at that point, I feel is kind of fine as well. I feel that 6 is a really good target for this, and I hope that maybe makes it all the way up the chain, but we shall see. But yeah, putting it back to 5 here, overall, definitely still within the ballpark of usability, because you got to remember that, yeah, tipping scales is a little bit higher than Umbra here. The strikers, of course, as we saw, a little bit above that as well. But here, this isn't per se in an unusable spot, because that for me would start behind the ongoing directive and behind the high end. It's not far ahead of the high end, but especially because it can retain its stacks so readily, it works out decently. I'm looking forward to kind of, in the future, kind of giving this a build showcase, because even in its current incarnation, it's okay-ish enough to definitely warrant a spot in the build collection. But maybe we can still see that 6 happen in some point. Let's go to one last one, which is, of course, the talent. And lastly, but actually definitely not leastly, we have Immobilize. This is amplifies weapon damage by 25% to ensnared enemy here for the perfect. And also, as with most of these status effect ones, after 3 kills, applies ensnare to an enemy, to the next enemy you hit. This is in the same style as, for instance, yeah, Sadist, Ignited, and Thunderstrike and such. And with the perfects, as with them, after 3 kills, it applies its status effect, and with the normals after 4. And this one, though, instead of the 35% that, for instance, Sadist and Ignited get, this only gets 25%, which kind of makes sense, because otherwise it would be too big of a boon alongside of them. Because ensnaring things is something that, for instance, especially in Legendary, we do a lot. And yeah, their foam eclipses are king, and this would maybe be too much of a buff alongside of them. For the perfect, we see that 25% here for a normal version. Yeah, it is 4 kills and then 20%. This though will be actually pretty handy to have, because also what we have is, of course, pressure point, where it is 15% to all status effect styles. And that combination with the normal variant of this of 20% and a 15 alongside of it is actually still pretty potent, for instance, to use on Legendary with the Tinkerer. Here though, on the perfect, we get the perfect on the Froth. Here, attack vector And this tag vector, of course, is one of the top SMGs. So with that, with a pretty good talent here, I could definitely see this getting some use in, especially Legendary or Masters, where we're learning it alongside of a Foam Eclipse. But even more so, we have also the Lockdown, which is an M870 here. And while it isn't the preferred one of the military one, quite often for headhunting, foaming something and then hitting them with this will actually be a very viable way to especially run a headhunter shotgun, because we would generally already run M870s there. And then alongside of that, we would either have it be with Pummel or with Brazen. And Brazen, of course, is not active from the first shot. That's more just if you fail to hit the helm, destroy the helmet on the first shot, then you can do subsequent shots. But what if you have 25% extra just because you foamed the enemy into place, or you have an ally that foamed them into place, let's say in Legendary alongside of a Foam Eclipse again? So this can be a really big damage boost that we have pretty good control over. And again, as well, after 3 kills, it applies it as well, because this is the perfect version again. And this I could definitely see getting some use, as yeah, we could, even if you're just headhunting with this, every 3 kills you would get one foam out of it. And while, yeah, of course, with headhunting, we want that likely that shot is going to be the kill, but in case it isn't, or in case it wasn't going to be, it's going to be much more likely to actually apply that kill. So this, especially alongside of just running a foam cam, I could see with headhunters being a really good play. And overall, this 20% that we can get from the normal version is already pretty hefty. If we take it over to the numbers, as we'll look at it here, with Equilize and Salvo kind of as our striker variant that we'll be using it here with, as of course that's going to be kind of the general meta going forward and such. But here, if we then add Immobilize on top, surprise, surprise, it's 20% on top. But again, as well, kind of confirming here that it is a separate multiplier. It is working in that intended way. This is, of course, just for the normal variant. But also, if we kind of then compare it to, for instance, Killer on the same build, on the same setting, we see that, for instance, Killer would be at 24%, because actually Killer is going to be bigger because of that lower crit that is caused by the Equalize and Salvo, because they eat a little bit into the crit, where we would go, for instance, Cheska plus Grupo if we were going to high-end pieces. So actually Killer is becoming much bigger than it used to be, kind of illustrating that. And of course, yeah, if we were just running Sadist and we were running so alongside of, let's say, maybe an OD, that would be at 30%. But I could very well see actually going for legendaries and such, going with, for instance, 2 strikers and an OD, and then the foam having basically the Immobilize plus Sadist combo, with Tinkers on the strikers, having that be the route to go. And yeah, that can be actually pretty potent here. And of course, we also even have the combination of going, for instance, Immobilize plus Pressure Point. I don't think this will be still a general use, because we already have Ignited and such. And while I quite often find myself, although more in more cases, me being the Fire Eclipse, but quite often I find myself alongside of Fire Eclipse as well. I don't go out of my way to go and grab an Pyromaniac or put Ignited on my weapon, partially because the time to do that and Killer is okay enough, and we'll activate Killer more than enough to get some more worth out of it. The downside of this would be also in Legendary, for instance, to consider, just to point that out, is that now when the foam, goes through the floor and doesn't hit anybody, which quite often, we send some foams to Narnia. Now it's an even bigger issue, because now also the damage bonuses of the damage dealers is getting affected by that. But I do think this definitely has a place, especially that shotgun, as I completely remembered the name of the Lockdown. That definitely will find a place, I feel, with headhunting and such. Because, yeah, you can foam the enemy with a foam canister, get a 25% amp going into that current shot. That can make all the difference in cracking a helmet or not. But in general play, I don't think it's a really good go-to, because also, for instance, if we want to have that CC ability, we would much more, I would per se personally lean much more towards, for instance, fire, having the ignited. But of course, here we are getting it on, for instance, an attack vector. That with Thunder's Fury, I could definitely see, and then every few kills, you foam an enemy, making it much easier to take them down. And sometimes just surviving matters more than doing the damage. But here, it is still doing pretty good damage. It is competitive with Killer when active. Killer's activation is always going to be, of course, yeah, it needs a kill to get going, but here as well, you need a source for foam for it to consistently be there. If you're going to rely on just foaming 1 in 3 enemies, you better damn hope that you're foaming names and such to make up for that, because otherwise, yeah, you're kind of basically splitting this in 3 if it's just general enemies and everybody's, you know, elites and such. Overall, though, I think this is a good addition to the game, and overall, one that we, you know, an obvious one that was still missing to foam. I am happy that, they didn't push this to 35, because that would actually be a little bit too potent, because in the settings that we use foam eclipses and such, that's usually when we're try-harding our best anyway, and adding too much damage there would actually be a little bit even more power creep than we're getting from some of the other pieces. But yeah, let's head on to a conclusion. And that all brings us to the end of this very long video. This PTS really had a lot to discover and go through. Especially, of course, getting a gear set and a brand set that are really competitive and really interesting in their own ways. Together with multiple exotics, especially the weapons that are pretty innovative. Yeah, we had a lot to cover there. But yeah, as we went through, let's actually kind of recap here, because especially I think the gear set could stand to gain a tiny bit of weapon damage. Basically, I feel taking that backpack from being a plus, well, taking it from 3 to 5, taking it from 3 to 6, that makes it so that kind of that backpack is kind of required, but also I don't think pushing the 3 to a 4 would make it that much. Well, that would open up some other avenues of kind of abusing it maybe and kind of getting too strong of a build out of it. But I feel especially with getting a little bit more out of the backpack would be nice there. But yeah, then it would definitely become one of the competitors for running Pestilence with, and that could be a good thing as well, where it could open up, because even still, the Langmo pieces are somewhat harder to get. This would still keep a place for the high-end one, because that one has much more upfront damage and can get up to damage much more quickly. So if you're doing something quick, that's the one you would go for. And then for longer sessions, then that concentrated could be the thing. And that would also kind of put it in line with, for instance, being a little bit closer to Umbra with full stacks, especially because it does take a while to get there. Even though that once it gets up there, it stays there quite a long time. And that's actually the nice thing about it. There is a consistency once you get it going, but it's kind of like Memento. It sometimes feels like it takes a while to get it going, and especially if you're really reliant on it, yeah, it hurts a little bit. Then, of course, yeah, we have unit alloys with its 2 names. I feel that especially unit alloys in itself kind of breaks with the philosophy of some of these brand sets. That part I'm kind of okay with, but especially then adding on top of that 2 named items, where one is Perfect Obliterate, which, yeah, on a really good brand set, and that makes it basically, even more so than the meta, somewhat more of a best in slot almost. Because if we're going Obliterate, we're going to go Equalizer. That part I'm not too un-okay with, but I do feel that, for instance, the Salvo actually does stand to lose a little bit of damage. Going from a 8 rate of fire to a 6 rate of fire, I feel would be much more in line, especially when we're comparing it to some of the other items that kind of have those bonuses. Because especially when it is with ARs, it is much further apart than, for instance, a Contractor's is when it is with a LMG. And yeah, overall, I think the brand set itself, it's kind of fine, but yeah, I would like to see, especially the Salvo, maybe receive a little bit of a retune. Overall, though, I am looking forward to just running these. They're giving us effectively a little bit of the damage that they took away from us with Project Resolve, at least from Strikers. Now that they're putting it out in high ends, and this, of course, does buff all builds. So there is something to be said for that, and I should definitely kind of highlight that part, because while we're kind of looking at it here as a buff to a striker build, it is also a buff to all the other builds as well. And of course, once we get this and once we see the final versions and we have the final game in likely actually in 2 weeks from now, then we'll do an in-depth look, and likely most of the build collection will be changed. I'm guessing more than half is going to be touched by the incoming of this unit alloys. If we then go to the exotics, Beacon is underperforming a little bit. I'm not sure how much you could push it further without it actually being a little bit broken, because it is, of course, a group buff, but so is Overwatch, and Overwatch already is exceeding it. So I feel you can push it a little bit further, but also that's, of course, just considering the damage side of things, because it also has regen and such, but I could see it standing to gain a little bit of damage. Bittersweet, I feel, is a really good spot, especially that buff that it has to headshots really makes up for it, and as we saw, going up against even Killer, as long as you're handling the buff well and landing your shots, especially while you have the buff, it will be really good. Then on the Sheriff, I feel this one definitely is overtuned, and even more so than the Salvo, I feel it stands to lose about 10% base damage difference, going from a 35 to a 25, and I feel then actually adding in some reload speed to it, even maybe more so than the 20% that other weapons would have from a mod, would actually even overall make for a better weapon. It would be balanced on the damage end, and it actually would feel decently, because now as well, it feels actually worse than some of the other weapons, even though it does more damage, but just because that reload is so much more impactful and just feels so much worse. This way as well, it would leave a place for things like light glue and SASGs and basically all of the crits used shotguns. Because otherwise, this will become the go-to. That 35% will exceed basically damage talents while active, and all of those damage talents on shotguns especially do require you to land your pellets or get some kills, or at least get a kill, for instance, for Killer. Having something that just exceeds them outright is maybe a little bit too much. And I'm perfectly on board with Immobilize, and yeah, definitely one that we kind of always expected. There is definitely a set list of status effects, and yeah, they're going through them here and there and adding one of them in. Immobilize, though, is definitely going to be useful for instance, if we're going legendary alongside of a foam eclipse, or for instance, with going alongside of them inside of a master mission, because there we often kind of go with them as well. And honestly, I was kind of here and there, often using a pressure point for that. Immobilize will take over that. But also then, for instance, Immobilize plus pressure point becomes an option, for instance, for using it with Tinker. Overall, though, this PTS definitely a lot of things to enjoy, especially as well because alongside of that, we have the modifier, and that modifier is looking interesting. It definitely doesn't have the damage of last season's modifier, but that's also, to me, not a bad thing. For a whole season, we kind of felt, at least I did, especially when I turned on the modifier, pretty OP, to a degree that when we turned on global events, we felt weak, which was a new feeling to have. But going into the next season, there is not that much damage into the modifier, but I'm kind of okay with that. There is definitely some utility there, because we have a decoy, basically, but also a very loud-mouthed decoy, and yeah, he needs to shut up. And it would be nice if we at least had a toggle to turn him off by itself without turning off all dialogue. But I do think, yeah, that's companion is actually an interesting thing, and I'll enjoy running around with a true son buddy just puppying around me. But yeah, that brings us to the end of this very long video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please do any and all of the algorithm things down below. For future videos, we are going to go get back and catch up on actually that blue and yellow stats video that I kind of teased. And yeah, we were definitely going to do until the PTS came out. And before the end of the season, I do want to get a tipping skills build showcase out. So I'll be following this one up, hopefully before the end of the season. So I hope you join me for those. But for now, as always, a good night.